Chapter 8:13. Near a secluded valley. Victor crawled on the ground nervously. He blended into the darkness and carefully lurked in the grass. May my Lord Soren protect me. Victor kissed his emblem and then walked around the valley in front of him from the side. During this time, the confrontation between the half-elf church and the shadow thieves had never stopped. Many excellent rogues had fallen as a result. The order from the higher-ups was to find the shadow thieves' lair, and then follow the clues to find the headquarters of the shadow church. This valley was one of the most likely targets. In order to spy on this place, many of the church's best members had fallen. Before Victor, there were already 3 first-rate rogues who had gone missing here. The terrain here is very hidden. Looking at the traces nearby, it should be man-made. Victor carefully avoided a trigger trap, and then climbed in from the side wall like a gecko. He was an acrobat before he became a rogue. He knew some tricks that other rogues did not know. Sometimes in this kind of mission, people like him who had special abilities often played a role. Someone was approaching. Victor immediately held his breath. He had cast a night vision spell in advance, so he could clearly see that someone was approaching. Shadow thieves. The one in the middle? Shadow wizard. Sure enough. Even if this is not their headquarters, it's one of their strongholds. Victor's figure crawled on the wall, hesitating whether to continue to investigate. After thinking for a long time, he finally decided to retreat. If this was really the headquarters of the shadow thieves, if he went in rashly, he would probably disappear mysteriously like the previous few people. It was better to send the news back to Mordor City first and see what the higher-ups had arranged. In the dark night, Victor retreated cautiously, and before he left a special mark nearby. Mordor City. The Shadow Plane. After spending a lot of manpower and material resources, the floating space tower project of Mordor City finally came to an end. At this time, all the higher-ups of Mordor City, including Soren, had gathered here. In front of them were Gloria and Fallen who were in charge of the experiment. The High Priest was responsible for maintaining the connection of the psionic field to avoid accidents. After all, this kind of experiment was still a bit troublesome. It consumed a lot of energy to raise a floating space tower. If it failed, it would be a small mushroom cloud. Fallen Witch's expression was a little excited and nervous. For a long time, she had devoted most of her energy to the study of the floating space city. Raising a floating space tower was the first step. As long as this step was completed, her plan to build a floating space tower would get a good start. Start of energy transmission. Thalling Experiment's voice and at the same time the elemental furnace, and temporarily cut off the energy supply to Mordor City. A cold mechanical voice. Floating Space Ring 1 activated. Floating Space Ring Ring, Floating Space Ring 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 Ring. The floating space tower. The ground began to tremble. Everyone looked nervously in front of them. Under the huge energy supply of the elemental furnace, the floating space rings buried under the arcane tower lit up one by one. The brilliance of magic energy lit up on countless dense runes, and then with a violent tremor, the arcane tower in front of them began to rise little by little. Finally, a piece of land about 3 kilometers in diameter rose to about 20 meters in the air. A huge pit appeared on the ground in front of them. In order to separate this piece of land, Gloria and Fallen made a lot of preparations. This not only required a lot of material resources, but also the spell of mud to stone to fix the whole foundation. Originally the progress was not so fast. But the emergence of Simulacrum greatly improved this efficiency. It was mentioned earlier that Simulacrum could retain 80% of the strength remembered by the original body. In the process of completing the entire foundation transformation, Gloria and Fallen replaced all the spells with mud to stone, and then kept memorizing Simulacrum, using the spell slots of the incarnation to complete the whole process. It took only 2 days to complete the underground layout of the entire floating space tower. The land below was not as simple as rocks. It included an elemental pool, a set of large-scale magic circuits, 3 underground laboratories, an energy balancing device, and many arranged magic circuit nodes. The entire arcane tower was only the part on the surface, and there were a lot of floating space rings and other magic devices buried underground. Liftoff complete. Activate the energy shield. The prompt of the Thalling experiment sounded again, accompanied by the appearance of a strange magic brilliance. A beam of light rose from the highest floor of the arcane tower, and then the corresponding beams of light appeared on the surrounding ground. Finally, all the magic circuits formed a node in mid-air, turning into an oval shield that wrapped the entire floating space tower from all directions. The strong wind blowing from the shadow plane disappeared. The shield was not only to provide protection, but also to balance the environment inside the entire floating space tower. Activate the magic propulsion device. Start the test. A floating space tower not only had to be able to float, but it also had to be able to fly, and the flying speed could not be too slow. The brilliance of arcane magic emerged. A brilliance appeared on the first floor of the wizard tower, and then the entire floating space tower shook slightly, and then began to move slowly to the right, gradually increasing the speed, and finally about the same as the flying speed of a wyvern. This should be the limit. After all, the volume of the floating space island is too big. If the flying speed is too fast, the consumption of the energy shield will be even greater. Gloria's voice sounded and she said, "Everything is stable at present. The energy consumption is about 10%. With the function of the elemental furnace, it should be able to withstand it." Although it seemed to only consume 10% of the energy, this was only normal operation after all. If he entered a combat state, then the energy consumption would increase exponentially. Normally, 10% of the energy consumption would be consumed, but in a combat state he would need at least 60%. It seemed that the limit that the elemental furnace could provide was a floating space tower. To reach the standard of a floating space city, it was still necessary to find a way to understand the mystery of elemental fission, because only in this way could a larger floating space city be supported. "Do you want to teleport back to Motor City?" Soren's voice sounded in the psychic field. After all, the shadow plane is not a long-term place. It would be best to move back to the material plane. Fallen Witch's voice sounded, "Not yet. This is just the first floating space test. We need to further test the stability of the floating space tower. And the foundation of this floating space tower has not been repaired. If it is teleported to the material plane, the landing may cause internal damage." Hearing Karina's words, Soren could not help but look at the bottom of the floating space tower. Sure enough, it had not been repaired, but it was directly separated from the ground. If it wanted to land, it must be redesigned below to ensure that the floating space tower could land in most geographical environments. It was unrealistic to float all the time. Because it consumed a lot of energy, the weight of the rising part had exceeded that of dozens of aircraft carriers. "Okay. It's up to you in this regard." Soren seemed to remember something and said, "How is the research of the superconducting magical pulse cannon? Can it be copied and transferred to other places?" Gloria answered him. She shook her head and said, "Not yet. We don't have enough manpower. We lack enough legendary spellcasters. It's impossible to do so many things with my mother's ability alone." This was something that could not be helped. Any research requirements during the Arcane Empire were very high, and only legendary spellcasters could meet the requirements. At present, there were only 3 people in Motor City who were qualified to research: Gloria, Fallen Witch, and Alice, a legendary puppet master. Even Soren was not qualified to do this. He spread out his hands. His alchemy skills were too low. As a true god, the master of Motor City, Soren usually had too many things to do. Moreover, there was the Shadow Lord to deal with. Alchemy was a basic skill that required a lot of time, so he had no time to practice it. Moreover, this basic skill would not directly improve his strength. He could only wait until he had free time to study it. "Let's start the last step of the test." Speaking of this, Fallen Witch's voice was a little nervous and she said slowly, "Activate the defense lock device." But the elemental furnace suddenly shook, and then it emitted a dazzling light. This meant that the energy operation was suddenly improved by a lot, and at the same time the magnetic field around it began to become chaotic in an instant. The defense lock was activated. As one of the core structures of the floating space tower and the floating space city, it was useless to rely on an energy shield alone. It was a huge target. To really make the floating space tower powerful enough, the defense lock was one of the necessary components. The power of a domain spread. When the floating space tower's defense lock was activated, Soren suddenly had a feeling of breathing discomfort and rejection. This was the energy field of the defense lock. When the defense lock was strong enough, it could even cover the magic net so that the people inside it could not cast spells at all. The floating space tower's defense lock was not that strong yet. However, the formation of an energy field was inevitable. As long as it was within the range of this defense lock, any enemy's ability to cast spells would be greatly reduced. This ratio was at least 30%. If the floating space tower's defense lock could be improved a little more, then it could directly seal the ability of all enemies to cast low-level spells of Circle 1 to Circle 3. In other words, once the defense lock was activated, wizards below the middle level would directly become useless. P.S. If you like this book, you can follow Fu2's public account on WeChat. Chapter 8:14. The magic lock is stable. When the cold mechanical voice of the Thaling experiment sounded, everyone present could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. The magic lock was the most important part of the floating space tower because the floating space tower was connected to the war chest half-bit wall. If there was a rejection reaction, the result would be quite complicated, and the time spent would be doubled. But if there was no problem with the magic lock, a little modification could directly transfer the floating space tower to the material plane. It seems to be successful. Soren could not help but breathe a sigh of relief, then raised his hand and waved to open a door, and directly entered the war chest half-bit wall. As he obtained the highest authority inside the arcane tower, the authority of the war chest half-bit wall was also opened. Unfortunately, Soren's knowledge of arcane magic was not enough to crack the mystery of this half-bit wall. Even Gloria and the Fallen, which could not analyze the strange ability similar to the illusion simulated by virtual reality. The entire war chest half-bit wall was a huge server array. It looked like a pyramid. The lowest level was the elemental pool of the half-bit wall, and then the corresponding level of space of a certain bit wall. The first level was earth. The second level was wind. The third level was water. The fourth level was fire. The fifth level was light. The sixth level was dark. The seventh level was the elemental pool, connected to the four major elemental bit wall, and at the same time maintained the passage to the upper and lower bit wall. If the half-bit wall created by Gloria was level 1, then the war chest half-bit wall was at least level 20. It had existed for thousands of years, and its area and energy had expanded to an amazing extent. In terms of the scope of space, the war chest half-bit wall was much larger than the half-bit wall controlled by the Northern Witch Council. Every level was an array. All of them were simulation games of war chess. The controller could let people's minds enter it, and then simulate a virtual reality effect with an extremely mysterious illusion. It was just like the virtual reality game before Soren's time travel. The only difference was that the former was completed through magic, while the latter was directly connected to the human nervous system and arranged by a super brain. Of course. Seriously speaking, the war chess demi-plane couldn't even compare to the virtual games of the interstellar era. First of all, the world was not big enough. Secondly, its computing power was far inferior to the super AI. It was likely that Thaling 13 was the one controlling the illusion in the half-plane of war chess. To a certain extent, Thaling could also be transformed into a supercomputer. They could be given powerful computing power to help manage the entire floating city, just like the computing power of the Divine Network. However, the demi-plane of war chess had its own advantages, and that was its extreme realism. Dreamland. Soren didn't quite understand what this thing was for. It was far more realistic than the virtual reality of the star-studded era. War chess. This card deck was once all the rage during the Arcane Empire, including the card of all things, arcane cards, tarot cards, cards of fate, and so on. This series of card decks were all derived from war chess. In other words, these things used to be prizes and props in war chess games. Why did the great arcanist create something like this? Soren had been thinking about this for a long time. Was it just for entertainment? This was definitely impossible. The great arcanists wouldn't be so bored as to spend so much energy just to make a prop for entertainment. Finally, Soren thought of the most likely scenario. Experience. During the Arcane Empire, the threshold for spellcasters was quite high. Those who were qualified to become arcanists were all geniuses, that is, those who were born with extraordinary intelligence of more than 20 points. This kind of person was definitely very rare. It could be said that any loss was difficult to make up for in a short time. People who were born with intelligence of 20 points were not just 1 in 10,000, but for the entire civilization of the Arcane Empire, ordinary spellcasters were not of much value at all. Only those who were born with intelligence of more than 20 points were likely to become great arcanists. Only then could they inherit and strengthen the power of the Arcane Empire. Then, how could these geniuses improve their strength? Let them take risks like other ordinary professions? What if he died before he was done with his training? If such a person died, where could they find another one? The purpose of the great arcanists creating the war chess game was to provide them with the most basic platform, so that they could face all kinds of death threats without dying to train their strength and wisdom. To be honest, so far there were only 2 people around Soren who might be born with extraordinary intelligence. One was Gloria. The other was Fallen Witch. Now both of them were legendary witches, and there was almost no one else who had such talent. One could imagine how rare it was to have the talent of a great arcanist at that time. If there were no accidents, they could basically become legendary spellcasters. Of course. The purpose of the war chess game was not only to train the arcanists, but also to other professions who were born with extraordinary intelligence. For example, Lulu. The speed of her strength improvement was frightening. Now she was not yet an adult, but she was already a high-grade profession. It could be said that she would definitely be a legendary profession when she grew up. This was the most likely use of the war chess demiplane that Soren could think of. Otherwise, he really couldn't think of any other uses for the war chess demiplane. A large-scale entertainment game? This was not impossible. The combat power of the people in the Arcane Empire was very high. Maybe it had something to do with this war chess game. It just provided a platform and it would not give any ability. Anyone who entered the war chess demiplane would rely on their own skills to fight. Without combat skills and strength, it would be a dead end. Soren's current idea was whether he could use the war chess demiplane to train the group of people with the best potential in Mordor City. He was someone who had personally experienced the war chess demiplane, and he knew how useful this thing was. It was absolutely more useful for a person's combat potential and skill training than usual. After all, a person could not always face the threat of death, and there were not many people who could survive such a situation in reality. However, the war chess demiplane only affected the mind slightly. Of course. In fact, it still affected the soul a little. After Soren mastered the war chess demiplane, he found that the death of the trial inside would cause a loss of soul power. But it was very little. In terms of data, it was about a reduction of about 1000 slaughter EXP. This trace of soul power was absorbed by the war chess demiplane and then transformed into the magic circle. Soren felt that the intelligence of the virtual character inside was related to a trace of soul power that was stripped off when the character died. What was the mystery behind it? With Soren's current knowledge, it was not enough to crack it. Because this was the field of arcane magic, not the field of gods. But one thing that Soren could be sure of was that the research during the Arcane Empire had already begun to involve the field of soul. No wonder the gods were not so friendly to the Arcane Empire. How should I use this thing? Soren looked at the war chess demiplane in front of him and fell into deep thought. To be honest, this thing could be used in many ways. First of all, Mordor City had a large number of outstanding talents who were facing a breakthrough, such as Lulu, Ugly Monkey, Jack, Scarface, Cyclops, and Giant who had already broken through the legendary realm. What these people lacked was a more extreme kind of training. For strong people like them, losing about 1000 slaughter EXP was not a problem at all. If it could be exchanged for a chance to face death, it was definitely worth it. They were the first targets that Soren considered. Then there was the group of people near the middle of Mordor City. Many excellent officers could also be trained. Finally, it was the ordinary people and low-grade professions. These people might not be able to enter it for the time being. Ordinary people who had their soul power extracted equivalent to 1000 slaughter EXP would be bedridden for more than 3 months. If the low-grade professions died a few times, they might face the danger of losing a level. In other words, this thing was provided for professions and they must be strong, determined, and have enough potential. Otherwise, if they died in the illusion, their body would really die. There was no other way. The war chess game was too realistic. There is no way to promote it in a short time. Soren looked at the elemental pool at the bottom and murmured, "But we can test it a little at the moment. Let's see if the trial of the war chess demiplane has any effect on those talented people. But we can't test it continuously. Let's choose a few excellent targets and see how it works." After Soren died in it, he felt a little uncomfortable mentally. One thing for sure was that this thing had side effects, and the side effects would be very serious for ordinary people. The specific effect still needed to be tested. Soren had a lot of things along the way and it would take a lot of time to study the war chess demiplane. However, the potential of this thing was unpredictable. If it could really reduce the side effects, maybe Mordor City could mass-produce a group of elite troops who dared to face death. To some extent, the Arcane Empire was really similar to the Interstellar Era. Because when this virtual reality technology was first researched, the first application was to train super soldiers. It was just that one used the technology tree and the other used alchemy. Mordor City. The Great Temple. When Soren returned to the Great Temple, the High Priest was already waiting there. "My lord." The High Priest bowed slightly and said softly, "The divine artifact Mithril Chain Mail is a little troublesome. I'm afraid I can't complete it in a short time. I need to study the psionic imprint on it. Greybeard should have obtained some knowledge about the Psychic Empire. I need to understand these special psionic imprints first." Soren nodded and said, "It's okay. You can study this thing first. I don't need it for the time being." The biggest enemy at the moment was the Shadow Lord. Soren had prepared a big gift for him. To deal with him, Soren had a super meat shield in front of him. It didn't matter if he wore the divine artifact mithril chainmail or not. Ascendant, Eugene. This was a super meat shield in the material plane. Chapter 8:15. Outer Islands. Motor City. As soon as Soren returned to the Great Temple, the bishop in charge of the South Coast region sent back a piece of good news. They found the Shadow Thief's lair. But the good news was accompanied by bad news. The rogues sent by Soren also found the followers of the Lady of the Night, greater divine power. The Lady of the Night was one of the oldest evil gods. Although she had cooperated with the Lord of Shadows, that was before the Avatar crisis. The Lady of the Night wanted to seize the Shadow Priesthood to further strengthen her power. Because she originally had the Priesthood of the Night, if she could seize the Shadow Priesthood, then the power of the Lady of the Night would become very terrible. The emblem of the Lady of the Night was very recognizable, a purple ring wrapped around a black disc. Another point that must be mentioned was that the kingdom of the Lady of the Night was also in the Shadow Plane, but it was an independent kingdom called the Shadow Realm. The mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the aureole behind? Soren gently put down the information in his hand, and there was a mocking expression on his face. If the Lord of Shadows was the mantis, then the Lady of the Night was naturally the aureole, and Soren, as a new god, naturally looked like the cicada caught in the trap. This also proved why the Lord of Shadows had been able to hold back from attacking Soren personally until now, because there was a Lady of the Night behind him, waiting for the Lord of Shadows to reveal himself. However, the Avatar crisis was the most chaotic period. Although the Lady of the Night was staring at the Lord of Shadows, other great gods in the righteous camp were also watching her. Especially the Lord of Light, he had always believed that the Lady of the Night was one of the root causes of evil. Now it's a situation of multi-party game. Soren slowly put down the information in his hand and murmured, "At this time, no one dares to act rashly. But such a situation is also suitable for fishing in troubled waters. If you want to get the greatest benefits, you have to rely on your own means." However, now that the Lord of Shadows had revealed himself, Soren naturally had to take the initiative to attack. He immediately sent a magic message to Arendelle. The prey has appeared. Soren inherited part of the priesthood of the god of the hunt, Malor. To some extent he was also a hunter. Although there were traces of the Lord of Shadows, he still had to think about the specific action of action. Soren wanted to muddy the waters. Only when the water of the water was muddy the waters would not pay too much attention to the other gods. This could not be helped. Soren first killed the demigod vampire, and then killed the god of the hunt, Malor. Now even the Shadow Lord died in his hands. Of the god Shadow God. Although many gods had fallen during the Avatar crisis, it was still the early stage after all. Not a single god with mid-level divine power had died yet. His actions now could easily attract the attention of the other old gods. According to the original history of the Avatar crisis, there would be a conflict between the old gods in about 3 or 4 months. In particular, the return of the Orc god system would lead to the fall of a group of gods with mid-level divine powers. If Soren killed the Lord of Shadows at this time, it would attract a lot less attention. It had to be said. There were benefits to the goddess of magic being alive, but it was also because she was still alive that all the gods with great divine power were more restrained at present. The Lady of Silvermoon had not recovered her power, so naturally she had not started her revenge. The sequence of history would probably have to wait until the second wave of impact of the return of the Orc god system. According to the track of history, the Orc god system finally began to return to the material plane after thousands of years of silence, and the Orc god reappeared in the eyes of the world. The orcs were not natives of the material plane. They came from other planes and spaces. Many races in the material plane were not natives, including beholders, mind flayers, lizard men, and so on. It was common for foreign races to eventually settle in the material plane. Most of the orcs were in another semi-material plane. Astral world exploration. At the beginning, the Arcane Empire vigorously developed the resources of the astral world for the purpose of finding other suitable planes and spaces for survival. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. Soren was always paying attention to the movements of the Lord of Shadows, and as March gradually passed, various news began to come from the Orc Kingdom. First of all, it was that the Orc army seemed to have a fight with the dwarves over a piece of land with rich mines. But this was just the beginning. The outside world was still wondering why the Orcs, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly moved, and then they continued to have conflicts with other races. The second race that broke out in conflict was the Prairie Elves. Although the Orcs were an agricultural civilization, there were many nomadic clans inside. The conflict broke out because of the prairie land. The two sides directly confronted each other, and it seemed that the orcs had the upper hand. This time, the outside world finally couldn't sit still. For a long time, the orcs had not been the most powerful race in the material plane. Although the most populous race included the orcs, humans, elves, and dwarves still had a huge advantage. The population of the orcs was only 1/20th of that of humans, 1/4 of that of elves, and about 1/2 of that of dwarves. Since the silence of the orc god system, the entire race had been quite low-key. Now that they suddenly became so high-profile, it immediately attracted a lot of attention in the material plane. In particular, the kingdom of the god of hunting had recently fallen near the orc territory. It was about the 5th day. A news suddenly spread to the high-level figures in the material plane. An organization went deep into the orc kingdom to spy, and finally they found a huge portal. Soren's news was sent by the Northern Witch Council. The Eye of the North personally sent him a magic message, which recorded the changes that had happened in the orc kingdom. They had built a huge portal. This portal was larger than any portal in the material plane. Looking at the entire material plane, perhaps only the ancient Amaska Empire had built such a portal. In order to capture slaves, the Amaska Empire did not hesitate to use the portal to break the plane barrier and directly capture slaves from another world. The orcs also appeared in the material plane at that time. At that time, the Amaska Empire's act of capturing slaves directly angered two powerful god systems from other planes. The gods and saints fought in the mortal world, which directly led to the beginning of the destruction of an ancient and glorious empire. In the message sent by the Eye of the North, it was directly pointed out that this portal might be related to the portal of the Amaska Empire. This portal directly led to another world, which was very likely to be the plane where the orcs were born. The orc god system finally couldn't help but make a move. Soren slowly put down the information in his hand and murmured, "Is Grumsh going to take revenge by using the Avatar Crisis?" Grumsh was the main god of the orc god system. He hated all gods and species that were not orcs. He was a standard racist, and in the War of the Orcs he fought head-on with the god system of the material plane. Unfortunately, he lost at that time. Moreover, the main god of the orcs lost an eye because of this. It was said that it was taken away by the main god of the elves, Corellon. The orc god system was cruel and wild. They believed that the weak had no value. Even within the orcs, the strong could blatantly take away the land and wealth of the weak. Back then, when this portal opened, it was jokingly called the Door of Darkness by the adventurers. The main reason was that it symbolized that the orcs had officially begun to invade the material plane. After resting in silence for thousands of years, the orc god system was ready to face the gods of the material plane head-on again. The fiasco of the Amaska Empire had always been a shame to the orc god system. The orcs in the material plane today were basically the descendants of the orc slaves that were captured from the portal to another world. If this portal was really opened, then it was very likely that the orc god system would directly send troops from the original plane where the orcs were born. A powerful orc army from another world. This armed force would directly change the structure of the material plane. It would also allow the orcs, who had always been weak to other races, to suddenly have the ability to challenge humans, elves, and dwarves. What will come after all. Soren could not help but sigh. He found that some historical tracks of the Avatar Crisis could not be changed. Since the orc god system had already appeared, then the third major event should be happening soon. The Battle of the Twin of Destiny. The disaster of the Avatar Crisis was escalating step by step. The demon invasion of the Abyss was just an appetizer. The Battle of the Gods was the main show. When the Lord of Hell, Asmodeus, also appeared, the critical moment that really determined the future of the multiverse had arrived. The time was April. Soren was not sure whether it was early April or mid-April. For a long time, the Twin of Destiny, the goddess of fortune, and the goddess of misfortune, who had been traveling outside the world and the gods, had finally appeared. They would have their first confrontation in April. At the same time, there would also be 3 lucky gold coins during this period, and a card of destiny would be born. Thinking of this, Soren suddenly could not help but have a headache. The War of the Orcs had nothing to do with him. Even if the orc god system and the elf god system fought, he could also watch the fire burning across the river. But the battle between the goddess of fortune and the goddess of misfortune had something to do with him. Because Soren had the blessing of the goddess of misfortune, it was hard to say what the goddess of fortune would think of him. Maybe he would have no luck with luck in this life. The War of the Orcs. The main god of the orcs, Grumsh, and the main god of the elves, Corellon, had a head-on confrontation. Some gods on both sides died, and the conflict between the material planes directly escalated. The Queen of Spiders wanted to fish in troubled waters, and the movements of the Lady of Night were also very concerned about this. This was Soren's opportunity. When the battle between the Orc god system and the Elf god system broke out, it was also the time for him to deal with the Shadow Lord. Because at that time, no one would have the energy to pay too much attention to him. Chapter 8:16. Be lenient if you confess, be strict if you resist. The reason why I didn't update is that I went to the healthcare center to relax. 2:33, the sun shone on the quiet city of Mordor. Jack greeted his sister early in the morning, then packed his things and prepared to report to the barracks. He was now a middle-ranking officer in Mordor City, and his promotion speed was far faster than other colleagues. Of course, one reason was that his original strength was not bad. But another reason was his little nephew. This little guy, who was only 1.5 years old this year, was accepted as a disciple by an archbishop of Mordor City. In the future he would almost certainly sit in one of the 12 seats inside the half-elf church. Under the high priest, there were a total of 12 seats in the half-elf church, which belonged to the central administration, the judiciary, and the bishops. Jack's nephew was almost certain to be one of the future archbishops. Nowadays, his little nephew spent most of his time in the temple receiving the glory baptism of Lord Soren. Every day the archbishop would hold a special prayer ceremony for him. He spent Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in the temple, while Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday were raised by his sister at home. Every Sunday's large prayer, Jack's little nephew would show up almost every time. Many people in Mordor City already knew that he was one of the successors of the archbishop. The little guy was very precocious. Sometimes Jack would feel a little nervous when he looked at him. Especially when he looked at Jack and his sister, Jack always felt a little guilty. Recently, his sister had been hoping that he could find a girl to marry. She even gave an example of the love between a drow instructor and a half-elf girl, but Jack always refused with the excuse of being busy with official business. Mordor City was always busy. Because there were always a lot of things that would be announced in the city hall, the whole city of Mordor was a high-speed machine. Some of the orders came from the highest level of Mordor City, that was, the Great Soren. Another part of the orders came from the Council of Mordor City. After such a long time, the officials finally began to adapt to the current system. They not only carried out orders, but they also began to learn to think and issue decrees in the way of Soren. For example, the recent trade reform in Mordor City was discussed by the council and then reported to the higher-ups. As usual, the first place Jack rushed to was the barracks. Recently, the higher-ups of Mordor City had plans to send troops to the outside world. Many officers were eager to give it a try, and Jack was also one of the young people who took the initiative to volunteer. Sir Soren is the Pirate King. However, he was not an ordinary Pirate King. He had almost single-handedly established a kingdom in the Outer Islands. Therefore, the army of Mordor was divided into two camps. One was the old pirate leader camp. Almost all of them were assigned to manage overseas territories for Soren. The other was the military camp of Mordor City. There were more elites in this camp, and they were all newly promoted young people. Jack, like many of his colleagues, hoped to obtain a position that was not inferior to the other pirate leaders. If you want to improve your status in Mordor City, the simplest and most direct way is to get military merits. As soon as he arrived near the barracks, Jack suddenly heard cries of surprise coming from all around, followed by a commotion. He could faintly hear the sound of the guards quickly gathering. What happened? Jack saw that the others couldn't help but look up at the sky in horror. He quickly followed suit and looked up. What he saw made him suck in a breath of cold air. A huge tower appeared over the city of Mordor. The huge shadow almost completely covered the central square. With a sharp alarm, the guards of Mordor City quickly gathered. However, even if they had seen too many new things when a floating space tower appeared over Mordor City, they were still shocked. Many people could not help but feel shocked and a little scared. This was a wizard's tower. God knows how terrible its lethality was. The material plane had been in awe of spellcasters for thousands of years. Ordinary soldiers were already a little scared when they saw this arcane tower. Prepare for battle. Send someone to inform Sir Gloria. An unknown tower suddenly appeared in Mordor City. Send the news immediately. A bearded officer rushed out. Although there was a trace of fear in his eyes, he still led the soldiers to gather. However, at this time the figure of the high priest appeared, and then the figure of Gloria also appeared in the air. The situation is smoother than we thought. Gloria looked down at the panicked residents of Mordor City under her feet and said slowly, The first teleportation was successful. Mother, you are going to move the tower to the south of Mordor City. After that, Gloria slowly lowered her height and said to the other surprised people in a gentle voice, "This is the tower that belongs to the city of Mordor. But it was not completed until today. You don't have to panic, all of you can leave." Mordor City? The Tower of Mordor City? When did Mordor City have a wizard tower? Jack's brain couldn't wrap itself around it for a while, but he quickly reacted. He didn't know the news from the upper level of Mordor City. He didn't know when a tower was built in Mordor City. But soon, a trace of excitement and joy appeared on his face. After all, this was a wizard tower, and the combat power of a wizard tower was top-notch. Mordor City now had a wizard tower which was almost unbreakable. Even if the Devil Legion came again, there was no need to worry. It was a freaking flying adept's tower. They had never heard of it before. Even a wizard tower could fly. How many powerful secret cards did the upper level of Mordor City have? The crowd was completely excited. Many people were looking at the tower in the sky with excitement, curiosity, and awe. The wizard tower was flying slowly, gradually approaching the south of Mordor City. At the same time, those spies who were secretly lurking in Mordor City, or were friendly, or were observing, or had bad intentions, were all frightened at this moment. Wizard Tower. This alone was not enough to scare them because there were many legendary spellcasters who had towers in the material plane, but there was no one who had a flying floating space tower so far. Floating Space City? People with active minds immediately thought of this. Had Mordor City mastered some technology of the Floating Space City? The Temple of Wealth. The tall gold priest was immediately alarmed. She had been responsible for the management of the temple in Port Mordor. When the floating space tower appeared, she was alarmed. But when she saw the floating space tower with her own eyes, there was still a trace of uncontrollable horror on her face, and she immediately said, "Send the news back to the City of Wealth immediately." Mordor City must have mastered some cutting-edge alchemy from the Arcane Empire. Report to the Archbishop. We must establish a stronger alliance with Mordor City before others. Golem Legion. Floating Space Tower. The two most critical parts of Mordor City were now there. God knew when the whole city would be floating. If that was the case, Mordor City might become the most powerful force in the material plane. It was not only the Temple of Wealth that was full of horror, but also the Temple of Sea. They immediately began to report to the church's upper level. Other forces reacted even more quickly, especially the members of the Northern Witch Council. The witches who did not join Mordor City were a little annoyed, but they quickly sent the news back to the north. And those who joined Mordor City were very excited because Mordor City even had a floating space tower. It was conceivable that the upper level must have other top knowledge. And it was possible for them to learn all of this knowledge. For the sudden appearance of the floating space tower in Mordor City, the three places that responded the fastest were the Northern Witch Council, the Wizard Alliance, and the last was Arendelle. Soren received a magic message from Arendelle almost on the same day. Princess Royal left him a message. "I'll be there tomorrow." Soren did not reveal much about the research progress of Mordor City, but Princess Royal still knew a little about it. After all, the relationship between the two sides was quite close. Arendelle had powerful ice witches and had built several wizard towers. The appearance of the floating space tower was an irresistible knowledge for Princess Royal. She was very eager to get other mysteries and use them to improve the strength of Arendelle. Of course, there was no free lunch in the world. Although Soren and Princess Anna had a close relationship, and he also had a good friendship with Princess Royal, when it came to such top knowledge, the other party must pay a price. The situation was turbulent. Soren had already expected the appearance of the floating space tower. The elder princess and the Eye of the North informed him almost immediately that they would come back to visit, and the representative of the Wizard City also arrived in Mordor the next day. They were also eager to get the internal knowledge of the floating space tower. But this kind of top alchemy knowledge could not be handed out casually. These people must pay the corresponding price. What do you think? Soren turned and glanced at Gloria, then glanced at the fallen witch and said, "The appearance of the floating space tower has alarmed them. We can't refuse all of them. How should we deal with them?" Gloria pondered for a moment, and then did not hesitate to sell out the Northern Witch Council. She said, "The Northern Witch Council has a fragment of the Silver Blade of Gith. It can be used to complete your artifact. There is also some knowledge about the magic lock and energy transmission. These are one of the conditions of the exchange. I'm not very clear about the Wizard Alliance. But they must hand over the energy shield technology they have mastered. Arcane puppets and arcane guards are far more powerful than golem puppets. To get the knowledge of the floating space tower, they must take out these things in exchange. And about the extra-dimensional fortress, my mother and I are very interested in it. The Wizard City must give us permission to explore it. As for the Princess Royal. Speaking of this, Gloria could not help but glance at Soren and said, I don't want to get involved in her affairs. You can do as you see fit. Hearing Gloria's words, Soren's expression suddenly became a little more awkward. Chapter 8:17. The city of Mordor suddenly became lively. Since the appearance of the floating island, the floating population of the city of Mordor had suddenly increased by 30%. Not only were there members from the Northern Witch Council, but there were also members from the more distant Wizard Kingdom, as well as the Arendelle Ice Witches who had just arrived this morning. In addition, there were many spies from other forces in the port of Mordor. Even Mrs. Rossard, the Duke of Red Dragon who had fought with Soren, secretly sent people to sneak into the city of Mordor to spy. However, these spies were wiped out by the rogues of the Judicial Department as soon as they entered the city of Mordor. The floating city. For a long time, many spellcasters had never given up on the study of the floating city. The appearance of the floating island in the city of Mordor directly led to many wizards preparing to visit the city. Even in just one day, many members from the Northern Witch Council secretly proposed to Gloria that they were willing to be her subordinates. Ordinary people could not imagine the spellcaster's desire for this cutting-edge alchemy. Looking at how easily the puppet master girl was taken back by Soren, it could be seen how amazing the temptation of the floating city was to them. Because there were too many people coming at once, Soren had no choice but to receive them separately. He was responsible for receiving the ice witches brought by Princess Royal Arendelle, while Gloria was responsible for receiving Her Excellency Eye of the North who was directly teleported over. As for the fallen witch, she was responsible for negotiating with the representatives of the Wizard Alliance. The existence of the floating island could not be hidden at present, and part of the alchemy knowledge could be exchanged. The key was whether they were willing to pay the corresponding price. Of course, what Soren was willing to take out was only the superficial things of the floating space tower. The content was limited to the floating ring. As for the core, elemental furnace, Soren would never hand it over. The energy supply of the floating space tower could be provided by manpower, magic circles, elemental pool, half-bit wall, and so on. The specific extent still depended on the amount of energy provided. Relying on the elemental pool in the demi-plane, the most they could do was float in the air. It was like a car that had $100 worth of gas. It could run for a while, but once it ran out, it could only start again after the elemental pool was fully charged. The biggest role of the elemental furnace was to provide long-lasting endurance and maximized energy supply. As long as Soren grasped this, he was not afraid that other forces would make a floating space tower, because their floating space towers could not fly far. This is it. The witches of Arendelle were placed in the station in the city of Mordor. This time, Soren took the elder princess to visit the floating space tower in person. Compared to the last time they met, she had become more beautiful elemental light. But, at the same time, she had become colder and colder, giving people the illusion that winter would come if they got close to her. This was the power of the gods. Princess Royal was integrating the power of the goddess of the north wind and snow, little by little. Although she had yet to truly ascend to godhood, she already had the illusion that she was as cold as a deity and treated all living things like ants. Perhaps only the people she cared about the most would be able to make the Princess Royal show human emotions. In contrast, Sauron's body had the smell of a mortal, even if he was already a true god. The core of the floating space tower is 3 parts: the elemental furnace, the floating space ring, and the half-bit wall. Soren glanced at Princess Royal, who had a cold expression. With the integration of the power of the clergy, Princess Royal's expression changed less and less. Her delicate and beautiful face was like ice that would never melt. If she could not find herself in the struggle with divinity and clergy, then she would eventually become like other gods. Eventually she would be interfered with by the clergy. She would be as emotionless and merciless as the winter. Soren could not help her with this. Everything could only rely on Princess Royal herself. If she did not overcome the interference of the clergy and divinity, she would inevitably embark on such a path. For example, the King of the Dead was almost completely kidnapped by his clergy. Well? Princess Royal nodded gently, glanced around and said slowly, "Where is the elemental furnace? Is it the key to the operation of the floating space tower?" Soren smiled and said, "The elemental furnace as the core, naturally cannot be placed in the open. It has been moved to the innermost part of the floating space tower. The Northern Witch Council and the Wizard Alliance have both sent people over. The energy part can rely on the elemental pool and the half-bit wall. Only you know about the elemental furnace. Princess Royal's expression changed slightly when she heard that, and then she said, "Can you take me to see it?" Soren immediately agreed. Then he waved his hand and opened a portal that led directly to a small space inside the floating space tower. The huge elemental furnace was in it. Incredible. Princess Royal's eyes flashed with the brilliance of divinity. She seemed to want to analyze the principle of the elemental furnace, but after looking at it for a while, she gave up and said slowly, "The alchemy knowledge involved in it is too profound. I can't understand it yet." Soren was not surprised, because he himself could not fully understand it. At present, in Motor City, only Gloria and Fallen Witch could understand it. The elemental furnace can be replaced with the half-bit wall. It is not difficult for you to open up a huge elemental pool with your ability. You can also achieve a similar effect with the power of the gods. Soren hesitated for a moment and said, "But in this case, you will have to pay a lot of divine power points." Princess Royal heard this and thought for a moment, then she said softly, "Don't worry about divine power. I have more than enough divine power now. I want the structure diagram of the floating ring, the layout diagram of the energy shield, the node structure diagram of the energy transmission, and the information related to the labyrinth." After looking around the floating space tower, Princess Royal did not mean to be polite at all. She directly asked for the most important information except for the elemental furnace. After all, her relationship with Soren was not ordinary. There was no need to beat around the bush like other forces. Soren did not hesitate too much and agreed on the spot, "I can give it to you tomorrow." "Very good." Princess Royal smiled when she heard that. She seemed to be in a good mood. She said playfully, "These things are the betrothal gifts for Anna." Betrothal gifts? What the hell was this? Soren was stunned when he heard that. The first reaction in his mind was that Princess Royal did not object to his relationship with Princess Anna. Then the eldest princess actually mentioned the word betrothal gift? Was she planning to marry Princess Anna to him? No. Things could not be that simple. Soren's thoughts were running fast for a moment. The next moment he guessed the problem. So, Soren raised his head and took a deep look at Princess Royal. He said slowly, "Are you going to be apatheicized?" Princess Royal nodded calmly. Sure enough, the corner of Soren's mouth could not help but reveal a wry smile. Was it because of this that the elder princess spoke? Princess Royal was going to be apatheicized. Then naturally she could not always be in charge of the royal power of Arendelle. As a god, there were almost no men in the entire material plane that could catch her eye. It was almost impossible for her to have offspring with a man. In that case, the royal power of Arendelle must be passed down by Princess Anna, the first successor. Since Princess Anna was just a mortal, then she must have offspring with a man to inherit the royal power of Arendelle. Then this man could not be anyone else except Soren. Princess Royal was already preparing for the funeral. Ba ba ba. It should be said that Princess Royal had already begun to prepare for the secular affairs after she was apatheicized. Even if this situation continued, the time of her passing on the throne to Princess Anna might be brought forward. Gods could not interfere too much with the secular world. Even a god like Soren, who had the domain of rule, was limited in his interference with the secular world. For example, Soren now handed over most of the secular affairs to the Council of Mordor City to deal with. He was only in charge of the general direction and did not participate in the specific things at all. If the gods were too involved in the secular affairs, they would definitely be backfired in the future. After all, Mordor City was just a new force. There were fewer internal entanglements, so it was not a big deal to manage it a little. But for an old kingdom like Arendelle, if Princess Royal continued to be personally involved in the secular world after apatheicized, it would definitely be harmful. If Princess Royal wanted to be apatheicized, she had to give up the royal power. Soren was also on the same path as her. Looking at the situation of Mordor City today, you could understand his next arrangement. Gloria was the mistress of Mordor City. Since Soren became a god, many of the affairs of Mordor City were handled by Gloria. Not only Gloria understood this, but even many of the higher-ups of Mordor City understood this. Otherwise, why would they be so determined to support Gloria's control of Mordor City? This was how Sauron, as a god, gradually went from being on the stage to being off the stage. In the future, his core would be transferred to the half-elf church, and Gloria would also become the lord of Mordor City at the right time. Soren would return to the dark side. As a god, he took charge of Mordor City through this means to avoid something similar to the law of cause and effect, from interfering with his rules as a true god. Under normal circumstances, the weaker the god, the more he interfered with the secular world. When it came to the level of the Lord of Light, it could be said that he did not even care about the internal affairs of the church. As for existences like the ancient god of death, Jurgel, it didn't even matter if there was a church or not. This was the case with some of the god's rules. When Soren first became a god, the church and Mordor City were both under his control. But now he was a lesser divine power. Mordor City was almost out of his control. He just set a general direction, and almost all the internal affairs of the half-elf church were handed over to the high priest. Soren's interference with the secular world was also reducing little by little. In the end, his existence must be as high and mighty as other gods. Princess Royal was so eager to give up the royal power. The only explanation was that she was going to become a god soon, and it was very likely that she would be a lesser divine power. She had to get rid of the relationship with the secular world and directly become the snow goddess that had widespread faith in all cold areas except for Arendelle. P.S. There is one more update today. The website is getting worse. Chapter 8:18. There was a dark red color in the turbid sea. There were many dead fish floating on the nearby sea. They were basically poisoned to death. The bodies of the Nagas could be seen further away. In addition, there were many very ferocious devil fish. Obviously, there had just been a war here, but the two sides of the war were not the races on land, but the Nagas and other marine creatures that lived in the sea. Many of them were marine creatures that were rarely seen in the material plane, including the deep-sea lurkers that could only be seen in the bottomless abyss. It's the believers of Dagon. A half-elf priest looked at the sea with a serious expression, and then said to the followers behind him, "Send the news back to Mordor City immediately. It seems that the Sea Temple has started a war with the demon lord, Dagon." The Battle of the Deep Sea had broken out. After accumulating power for so long, the demon lord, Dagon finally couldn't help but challenge the sea goddess. He himself was the demon Orbis who ruled the deep sea. If he wanted to seize the authority of the sea in the material plane, the sea goddess was an enemy that Dagon could not avoid. It could be said that it would be difficult for Dagon to extend his tentacles into the material plane without completely defeating the sea goddess. Outer Islands, Mordor City. As March gradually came to an end, the impact of the Avatar crisis struck again. Soren frowned as he looked at the information that was sent back in front of him and murmured, "Has it really started? Then I'm afraid we have to prepare to deal with the Shadow Lord." There was a lot of information sent back. First of all, the orcs finally fought with the prairie elves and won a big victory, seizing a large area of land in one fell swoop. The prairie elves were now forced to move to the forest area. It was said that the wood elves were very dissatisfied with the orcs' instigation of the war. On the other hand, the sea goddess was fighting with the demon lord, Dagon. The Nagas had confirmed that there was a serious conflict with the devil fish. There should be a huge portal somewhere in the deep sea connected to the bottomless abyss because many devil fish came from the Shadow Sea on the 89th floor of the bottomless abyss. This kind of thing must be left to the Nagas and the Sea Temple. Soren could only help them at most. The struggle at the bottom of the sea would not affect the structure of the material plane. Of course. At present, the most important news was related to the Shadow Lord. The reason why Soren felt that it was almost time to make a move was also related to the recent changes in the Church of another god. The God of Light. The Church of the God of Light had been mobilizing frequently recently, and there was a vague plan to go to war with the Church of the Lady of Night. A great divine power of the good alignment. A great god of the evil faction. Furthermore, they were both prejudiced against each other, and their hatred for each other had accumulated over the years. If the God of Light was really going to attack the Lady of the Night, then Soren's last concern would be gone. Basically, he did not have to worry about the Lady of the Night for the time being. Faced with a god like the God of Light, even the Lady of the Night would have a headache. This was the best opportunity. The Queen of Spiders' attention was currently focused on the elf god system. Once she dealt with the elf god system, which she hated the most, she would turn her attention to other gods. The Lady of the Night was now preoccupied by the God of Light and had no energy to pay attention to the Lord of Shadows. If Soren were to make a move now, he would not have to worry about the interference of powerful enemies. Of course, one of the more important reasons was that it was said that traces of the Goddess of Fortune had appeared in the northern part of the continent. The Goddess of Misfortune and the Goddess of Fortune. These two twins of destiny who were beyond the gods had finally appeared. Their struggle would affect the nerves of many gods, because the Avatar crisis itself was a torrent of fate. Things in Mordor were on the right track. Now negotiations and cooperation with the Northern Witch Council were slowly progressing. The Wizard Alliance also needed to discuss with the Archmages of the Council. The requirements put forward by Mordor were not low, and they might not be able to agree in a short time. With Gloria and Fallen Witch, Soren did not have to worry about the instability of his own rear. Before the Devils officially started, he felt that he still needed to find an opportunity to improve his strength. If he could advance to intermediate divine power, Soren would not have to be afraid even in the face of the old gods. And if he succeeded in killing the Lord of Shadows, then Soren's plan to establish his own divine system would begin. A divine system. The half-elf clergy must be separated from the main clergy after obtaining the shadow clergy. Soren had more long-term arrangements for these things. In a hidden basement, Uhtred walked in a hurry. Behind him were three cold-looking rogues. At first glance they were specially trained assassins. Bishop. A cold female voice appeared in the darkness. Although a woman with a rather beautiful appearance but a hideous scar on the side of her face appeared, she slowly said, "The recent movements in Mordor are abnormal. I'm worried that our whereabouts have been exposed." Had he been exposed? Uhtred's face turned ugly when he thought of this, and he slowly said, "What about the news inside the church? Haven't the support of the Shadow Church been sent yet?" Damn Mordor City. God knew that this opponent was so difficult to deal with. Originally, the Lord of Shadows was an intermediate divine power, and Soren was only a lesser divine power. One church had developed for thousands of years, and the other church had just been established recently. At the beginning of the operation, Uhtred thought it was just an entertainment to beat up children. But when the real battle started, he found that the enemy was much more difficult to deal with than he imagined. Soren was a new god, that was true. But after all, he inherited the original half-elf church, and he almost emptied the foundation of Autumnfall. The foundation of the entire Autumnfall was absorbed by Mordor City. The power inside the church was actually stronger than the outside world imagined. More importantly, Soren still had the power of the secular world. Most of the churches of the gods were independent of the secular world. That was to say, the Lord of Shadows did not control any kingdom. He only developed the church through his own influence in the material plane. At best, he secretly controlled some cities through the Shadow Thieves. But these cities could not be compared with Mordor City. Soren could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors with a wave of his hand, but the entire Shadow Church could not even mobilize 1/10 of the warriors of Mordor City. If it was about believers, the Lord of Shadows definitely had more than Soren. But believers were not equal to combat power. Only professionals could fight in the entire Shadow Church, and they must be devout believers. Those who believed in Pantheon may not be willing to risk their lives. But Mordor City did not have such concerns, because the army of Mordor City all obeyed Soren's orders. At first, there was no doubt that the Lord of Shadows had a clear advantage, but after the battle broke out in Shipwreck Bay, the situation had been completely reversed. The professions sent by Mordor City to fight against the Shadow Thieves and the Shadow Church were endless. Some of them were not believers of the church at all, but pirates who had been famous for a long time. After the battle entered a tug of war, it began to be unfavorable for the Shadow Church. Because the Shadow Church was facing the interest groups of the entire island of Mordor. Does the Lord have an oracle? Uhtred was silent for a moment, then suddenly said, "Where are the Shadow Thieves? Why haven't they arrived yet?" The woman standing in front of him shook her head. Suddenly there was a strange noise outside and a faint muffled sound came. The next moment, Uhtred's face changed greatly and he panicked, "Something's wrong. There's an enemy." As soon as his voice fell, there was a sound of fighting outside the basement door. Uhtred rushed out almost immediately. This was a sealed basement. If he was surrounded inside, there was nowhere to run. Uhtred rushed out quickly. But before he could make a move, a dagger had already pierced through his back. "He's there." The woman with a scar on the side of her face took back her weapon with a cold expression. After a cold look, she slowly lifted the spell on her body and said sarcastically, "I'm not Izair." Her appearance gradually changed. The most obvious feature was that her height suddenly increased a lot, then her eyebrows became much colder, and finally her ears became slightly pointed. Half-elf. Greater transformation. The half-elf assassin named Izair waved his hand and cut Uhtred's throat, then slowly said, "The Izair you're talking about is already dead. Otherwise, I really can't find your secret stronghold." Northern Witch Council. At the last moment of his life, Uhtred suddenly understood in his mind. Such an exquisite transformation spell was not something that ordinary people could use. The Northern Witch Council was behind the city of Mordor, and only the high-level members of the Northern Witch Council could make her look like Aesair, and he had never noticed this. Wizard. Damned adepts. Although there were also wizards inside the Shadow Church, there was no way to compete with such an old witch force. Most of them were rogues, followed by priests who served the gods, and finally shadow wizards who changed their professions. Life gradually faded away. The woman who turned into Aesair glanced at the corpse on the ground indifferently, and then her figure disappeared into the darkness. Today's battle had not yet started, but they had already found the location of the Shadow Lord. There would be a big battle next, which would determine the pattern of the rogues in the material plane for thousands of years to come. Shadow Lord, Shadow Church, Shadow Thief. Sorin, Half-Elf Church, Mordor City. If Sorin could defeat the Shadow Lord, then there would be a true god who combined the priesthood of rogue and shadow. From now on, all forces related to the rogues would be under Sorin's command. Similarly, if the Shadow Lord defeated Sorin, then his power would also be greatly improved. The battle between the two sides was destined to have one point, that was, from now on, the rogues and the shadow priesthood must be merged. Chapter 8:19. Second update, the wind was cold. Sorin stared at the valley in front of him with a cold expression, and his expression was unprecedentedly dignified. A big battle was inevitable after all. The enemy was in the dark while he was in the light. During this period of time, Sorin had been spending a lot of energy to find the headquarters of the Shadow Church and the Shadow Thieves. Now his efforts finally paid off and he found the headquarters of the enemy. This was a fair and square confrontation. With the cautious character of the Shadow King, it was too difficult for Sorin to trick him. Moreover, if the gods wanted to leave, ordinary people really had no way to stop them. Therefore, the safest and most effective way that Sorin could choose was to have a big battle with the enemy. The Shadow King could run away. But the Shadow Church and the Shadow Thieves couldn't run away. Sorin was forcing the Shadow King to fight with him head-on. Because this time, if he avoided the battle, the Shadow Church's forces in the material plane would be completely wiped out. If a god's church was destroyed by others, it could be said that there was no hope of turning over in the Avatar crisis. Who knew how many people would want to beat a drowning dog and take out the Shadow Lord who had lost all his forces in one go? The same principle could be applied to Sorin. If Motor City was destroyed, Sorin would almost be beaten back to his original state. Except for his own strength, it was difficult for him to do anything during the Avatar crisis. My lord. The figure of the ugly monkey appeared in front of Sorin. He respectfully knelt down on one knee and said, "In front is the headquarters of the Shadow Church. Below is a dense underground passage. We have lost a lot of people when we were spying. The Shadow Thieves have set up a lot of traps at the entrance. If we attack by force, I'm afraid we will suffer serious losses." The underground was the Shadow Church. No wonder the other gods couldn't find the headquarters of the Shadow King. They didn't expect him to place the headquarters underground. I see. Sorin nodded calmly and then said, "Let the others prepare for battle. When the Golem army arrives, you take people to attack from the side." Checkmate. If the battle between the gods was like a game of chess, then Sorin was like a general. In fact, if the Shadow Lord did not fight him head-on, he would even dare to flip the chessboard. Destroy the Church of the Shadow Lord and flatten the great temple of the Shadow Lord. At that time, there was no need for Sorin to fight him head-on. Just such a serious loss was enough to cause the strength of the Shadow Lord to plummet, and it might even fall directly to the level of lesser divine power. As long as the Shadow Lord's divine power dropped, Sorin would be able to take over the Shadow divinity even if he didn't kill him. When that happened, Sorin's power would increase while the Shadow Lord's power would weaken. Since ancient times, there had never been a lack of deities whose strength had plummeted due to the conflict between churches. Lady Silvermoon was an obvious example. When she was most severely suppressed by the Lady of the Night, the church was almost on the verge of collapse. She was also weakened to a minor divine power. In the end, she had no choice but to ask the goddess of love for protection. This was the limitation of an ordinary god. Sorin's strength was also gathered with the believers and divinity. If the half-elf church was destroyed, he would directly fall to a minor divine power. The divinity in his body might be taken away by the law because of losing his divinity. If the number of believers was too small, Sorin might even fall from a true god to a demigod. In the past, many gods gradually declined and fell like this. Divinity and divinity were integrated. Unless Soren's divinity reached the level of great, the two could never be separated. The Outer Islands. Motor City. Although Soren did not let Gloria and Fallen Witch participate in this battle, it was impossible to avoid a head-on confrontation with the Shadow Church. Gloria looked very nervous at this moment. She was even ready to teleport to the battlefield at any time. After all, the Shadow Lord was an old god. Moreover, he was an intermediate divine power god, which had a clear advantage over Soren. The relationship between Soren and the Shadow Lord was simply irreconcilable. The battle between the two sides was bound to end with the defeat of the other side. If the Shadow Church could be destroyed this time, even if the Shadow Lord was not killed, it was almost impossible for him to make a comeback. Start the elemental furnace. Lock the teleportation node. The Golem army is assembled. Open the portal. As a high-grade legendary psionic warlock, the High Priest was responsible for the command of this battle. He directly established a connection with the psionic field. The situation was quite similar to the last time when they attacked the Queen of Spiders. Start the teleportation. The Clay Golem army is activated. As a teleportation gate opened, clay golems appeared on the flat ground one after another in the night. The elites of the half-elves and the rogue church had all gathered. Almost 80% of the members of the Judgment Department, the Central Department, and the bishops had arrived on the battlefield. There were groups of rogues in the shadows. At this moment, their expressions were quite nervous because this was a battle to determine the future of the rogues. Whoever's god won, the other party would be able to dominate the world. Moreover, with the combination of the two clergies, Shadow and Rogue, the areas that everyone could access would increase. That was to say, no matter who won, the followers who served them could increase their strength. Soren's followers had been unable to access the Shadow area, and the followers of the Shadow Lord had been unable to access the Rogue and tracking areas. Let's begin. Soren's expression finally changed. After perceiving a familiar divine aura from the depths of the ground, he directly ordered, "Let the Golem army clear the way and directly flatten all the traps." The Shadow Lord finally appeared. Although the two sides had not yet fought, they both felt the familiar power of the clergy on each other. A shadow and a rogue, the collision between them was inevitable. The first batch of clay golems and stone golems began to move forward. As soon as they entered the valley, there was a violent explosion, and then 3 golems were directly destroyed on the spot. It's a burst trap. It looks like it was set up by a legendary rogue. This is a spike trap. This is a flame trap. A series of explosions came or the ground suddenly collapsed. Before they had completely entered the valley, more than 30 of the golems that Soren used to lead the way had been destroyed. If these traps were not destroyed by the golems, who knew how much combat power it would take? Looking at the golems being destroyed one after another, Soren did not even blink at the moment and continued in a deep voice. The second golem army continued to move forward. It only took about 10 minutes. Nearly 150 golems were all scrapped in the valley. Most of these golems were clay golems and stone golems, and their challenge rating was at most level 5. If they were bought from the Wizard Alliance, it would be equivalent to wasting nearly 300,000 Kindler. However, Mordor had the ability to make their own golem puppets, so the cost price was about 100,000 Kindler, and the traps set by the Shadow Church would probably need that many Kindler. The second batch of golem army continued to move forward. This time the number had increased by a lot. There were about 300 golems. Most of them were the cheapest clay golems and stone golems. But this time there were more than 10 steel golems mixed in. The continuous explosions were still ringing. In the face of Soren's move of using golems, the Shadow Church was obviously very troubled, especially the steel golems mixed in. Many traps were ineffective against them. It was impossible for flesh and blood to resist the traps, but the steel golems did not have so many taboos. There were already priests inside the Shadow Church, and they began to use divine spells to cooperate with the rogues to kill these steel golems. Are they going to send people out already? After Soren found the base of the Shadow Church, he directly used the portal to block the other party's door. This showed that he wanted to wipe them out. When the second batch of golem army was completely destroyed, a mocking smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and he slowly said, "Golem army number 3, attack." The portal was still maintained. As long as Soren was personally in charge, unless the Shadow Lord came to destroy it, the portal would always be in operation, and even if it was destroyed, another one could be opened immediately. Mordor City had enough resources to maintain the portal. The real battle had not yet begun. Soren squandered about 700,000 Kindler golems in just 2 waves of tentative attacks. War was a game that burned money. He dared to challenge the Shadow Lord, not only because of Princess Royal and Eugene, but also the strength of Mordor City itself. The portal continued to operate. The third batch of golem army that arrived was very different, because this time it was the main army of Mordor City that appeared. The clay golems were gone. This time there were about 500 golems, most of which were more advanced stone golems, then there were dozens of steel golems, and finally, there were a few diamond golems. At this moment, the faces of the enemies hidden in the shadows changed. If the clay golems and stone golems were not a threat, then the steel golems and diamond golems were simply nightmares. The rogues had no way to deal with these golems. You can still hold back. Soren had been paying attention to the movements of the Shadow Lord. Seeing that the other party had not moved, he could not help but chuckle and said, "Since you can hold back, then I will also compete with you in patience." The golem army continued to advance. For this war with the Shadow Church, Soren had prepared more than 3 million Kindler golems as consumables. If the Shadow Lord could hold back, then he would patiently use the golem army to exhaust the opponent. To put it bluntly, the golem factory in Mordor City had been operating at full capacity. If the Shadow Lord could hold back, Soren would smash the enemy down today even if he had to spend money. Rich, skilled. That's how willful he was. Chapter 820. The third wave of golems finally made the Shadow Church unable to sit still. The clay golem could almost be ignored by the golem army sent by Mordor City. This was a complete cannon fodder. But starting from the golems, their combat power had skyrocketed. An ordinary golem weighed up to 2,000 pounds and was about 3 meters tall. Its special ability was slow, which was an enchantment effect. It could make nearby enemies be affected by something similar to slow, and they had to carry out a compulsory test of will. The challenge rating of golems was above 8, and they could fight one-on-one with a profession level of 12 or above. Then there were the more advanced iron golems. The iron golems weighed about 3,500 to 5,000 pounds. Most of the iron golems in Mordor City weighed about 4,000 pounds and were about 3.5 meters tall. The iron golems were enchanted with poison spit, which could spit out poisonous gas within 3 meters around their bodies. If their physique was not enough, they would continue to be poisoned. The challenge rating of the iron golems was higher, and their resistance to physical damage and magic damage was not low. As for the diamond golems, there was no need to mention them. Any one of the legendary level golems was enough to give the Shadow Church a headache for a while. Facing the third wave of golems from Mordor City, the enemies of the Shadow Church finally couldn't sit still. Some wizards and priests began to cast spells to summon shadow creatures, and more shadow thieves and rogues joined the battle. Ah! A blood-curdling scream of near-death rang out. A shadow thief in the middle of the battle couldn't dodge in time. He was hit in the back by an iron golem on the spot. His entire spine was completely twisted under the huge force. He only had time to scream before he died. On the other side, the elites of Mordor City were still conserving their strength. They hadn't joined the battle yet, but the enemy had been suffering continuous casualties. The strength of Mordor City made them full of hope for victory. Even if the enemy was a church that had existed for thousands of years, they still believed that the final victory belonged to Mordor City. Golem army advance. Soren watched the battlefield calmly. When the enemies of the Shadow Church began to retreat, he finally gave the order to attack and said in a deep voice, "Prepare to attack. After entering the underground, fight in organized units, don't scatter easily." The Shadow Church finally couldn't afford to waste time. There were no casualties on Mordor City's side, but hundreds of people had died on their side. The followers of the Church of Shadows began to retreat into the underground tunnel, and the golem army that received Soren's order also began to advance. They were cannon fodder and consumables. If the golem army was destroyed, they could be rebuilt with money. However, if they died, it was basically impossible for them to be revived. As long as they could defeat the Shadow Lord, it would be worth it even if the golem army were to die here. Soren was now very rich, and there was an endless supply of minerals from Treasure Island. He wouldn't even bat an eyelid if he were to burn 1,000,000 Kindler in a war like this. Those from the tribunal, come with me. Bishops, bring up the rear. Ugly Monkey led a team of elite rogues to join the battle. They followed behind the steel golems. With the golems leading the way, the battle was much easier for them. They only needed to look for the fish that slipped through the net. However, as they entered the underground shrine, The paths leading to all directions appeared before their eyes. After all, the Church of Shadows had been in operation for thousands of years. They had dug out countless underground tunnels. At the same time, the corpses of Taurens and shadow creatures began to appear in front of them. Taurens could be tamed. Many powerful beings liked to use Taurens to guard mazes and dungeons, but Taurens had almost no advantage against the steel golems. They were easily crushed by the golems. The enemy would arrive in 30 seconds. Crush them. The elite troops of the tribunal and the bishops entered the depths of the underground, and the elite pirates behind them also began to fight separately. Soren's goal was to completely wipe out the Shadow Shrine, flatten the entire dungeon and leave no fish behind. Mordor City, floating island. The battle on Soren's side continued, and Gloria's work never stopped. Legendary target found in the third tunnel. The High Priest's telepathic message sounded instantly, and then Gloria gave an order. Number 1 Diamond Golem, go to the third tunnel to support. Order the bishops to send someone to the third tunnel to support. Elite Shadow Thief resistance found in the fifth tunnel. Number 2 Diamond Golem, go to support. Number 3 Diamond Golem, go to support. The priests of the Central Command are approaching. Open the portal. Alice is about to reach the battlefield, in a pitch-black underground tunnel. The members of the Half-Elf Church and the Shadow Church had already been fighting together. The resistance of the Shadow Thieves was a bit more than expected. When a small team of Shadow Wizards began to join the battle, the casualties of Mordor City began to rise rapidly. However, at this moment, a delicate girl appeared in this tunnel. She didn't look like a Westerner, and her body had obvious Oriental characteristics. Pucci. A cold light flashed, and the Shadow Wizard who was casting a spell suddenly felt a chill in his throat. Then he couldn't make any sound. At this time, intense pain came and blood gushed out of his throat like a fountain. In front of him was a small and exquisite puppet girl about 15 centimeters tall. This lifelike puppet girl floated in midair, holding a very pocket-sized long sword in her hand. The fatal blow just now was caused by her. Eastern Puppet Master. As if thinking of something, the Shadow Wizard in front of him was horrified, but everything was too late. Another puppet girl appeared behind him and ended the Shadow Wizard's life in an instant. These puppet girls, who were only a dozen centimeters tall, moved like the wind. They were undetectable in this dark environment. They were like assassins in the dark, constantly reaping the lives of the enemy. Alice's expression was calm. As a legendary puppet master, she had experienced a lot of battles and killings. Originally, her puppet girls were not as powerful as they were now, but after obtaining the alchemy knowledge of Mordor City, Alice had upgraded all her puppet maids once. She was the one who volunteered to participate in this battle because she wanted to test how much stronger her newly upgraded rune maids were compared to before. So far, the improved combat power of the puppet girls had exceeded her expectations. Chapter 821. The Church of Shadows was losing ground. Although there were not many casualties in the city of Mordor, there were probably more than 2 million Kindler golems that had been damaged. Arendel's tax last year was only more than 1 million Kindler golems, which meant that Soren had squandered the equivalent of 2 years of Arendel's tax in less than an hour. However, this price was worth it. If they didn't use so many golems to clear the way, the Half-Elf Church would have to pay thousands of casualties just to attack the underground. Human lives could not be bought with money. Soren only had so much money, and it would be a heavy loss if all of his core followers were killed. The same principle could be applied to the Lord of Shadows. He had never underestimated Soren's strength, and he had always regarded Soren as a threatening enemy. However, he still underestimated the power of Mordor City. That's right. The Lord of Shadows had guessed Soren's own strength, but he did not guess the hidden power of Mordor City. In the view of the Lord of Shadows, he definitely had a 70% to 80% chance of winning against Soren, so he took the initiative to attack Soren's church believers. But what he never thought was that the power of the Shadow Thieves and the Church of Shadows combined was absolutely impossible to defeat Mordor City, which had the support of the Northern Witch Council, Arendel's Ice Witches, and the Church of the City of Wealth. The Lord of Shadows had lost. But he did not lose to Soren's personal strength, but to Soren's influence in the secular world. Because some of these golems came from the Northern Witch Council. In order to get the floating ring technology of Mordor City, the Eye of the North also paid a big price, and some of the steel golems that participated in the battle today came from the Tower of the Northern Witch. The secular power of the Lord of Shadows had lost. It was impossible for the Church of Shadows and the Union of Shadow Thieves to fight against Mordor City alone, so there was only one chance for him to turn the tables, and that was to rely on his personal strength to kill Soren. As long as Soren died, the power of Mordor City would immediately collapse. Even with his shadow clergy, after killing Soren, he might be able to take over a large part of Mordor's power. Given the current situation, there was no way out for the Shadow Lord. Since he dared to avoid the battle, the Church of Shadows would definitely be destroyed today. Soren would definitely flatten his great temple in the material plane. As a god, there was no way he could sit back and watch the church be destroyed. Therefore, his only choice was to fall into Soren's trap and force the Lord of Shadows to attack him. Then he would activate the most crucial part of his plan. A powerful divine power surged from the underground city. Soren also sensed something at that moment. He narrowed his eyes and muttered, "You can't hold it in anymore?" He was forcing the Shadow King to attack him. Even if Soren was the Shadow Lord, there were only two choices he could make. One was to give up on the Church of Shadows and evacuate. The other was to kill the gods of the enemy church and directly disintegrate the attack of Mordor City. Shadow, realm. An invisible force spread, and the shadows around suddenly became more and more hazy. Soren disappeared in an instant. The next moment, the space where he was distorted, and then a dark void crack appeared. "So this is what you look like." The power of the shadow dissipated, and Soren's figure appeared 10 meters away. He looked at the front with a cold expression and said slowly, "The legendary Shadow Lord is actually a distorted shadow." Right in front of Soren, a distorted human-shaped shadow was suspended in mid-air. This was a special life form. The Shadow Lord gave up his flesh and blood and directly transformed his body into a half-energy life form with shadow energy. This form of god was rarely seen in the pantheon because most gods could not completely give up their flesh and blood. "Since you've already appeared, then stay." A strange light appeared near Soren's wrist, and then there was a violent fluctuation in the surrounding space. The next moment, the nearby temperature plummeted, and the ground was covered with a thin layer of frost in an instant. Ice realm. Princess Royal's proud figure appeared hundreds of meters away. The ability of the gods to change space blocked short-distance teleportation. Even she could only teleport 100 meters away. The god of half-elves and rogues. The voice of the Shadow Lord was as empty as the void. He looked at Soren indifferently and said slowly, "Is this your last card? You want to kill me with the help of a mere mortal?" Princess Royal did not become a god. That was to say, in the eyes of the Shadow Lord, no matter how powerful she was just a mortal. Mortals were still too weak for gods. Of course, this was just what the Shadow Lord thought. In the face of the Shadow Lord's contempt, Princess Royal's expression was obviously a little unhappy, but she did not say anything. Instead, she used the power of ice and snow to block the surroundings in an instant. As the most powerful mortal in the material plane, although she had the power of a god, neither she nor Soren could kill the Shadow Lord alone. "Of course I won't look down on you." Soren's mouth evoked a sarcastic smile and said slowly, "Since I'm going to deal with you, I naturally have to prepare more helpers." Bang. About 300 meters away from Soren, a burly and old figure slowly appeared. It was a half-orc who looked resolute but had already entered its twilight years. Its bare chest was painted with gray-white paint, which was the ashes of half-orc warriors. The war shamans relied on them to awaken the power of the ancient ancestral spirits. Divine Ascender, Eugene. The old half-orc approached step by step. With every step he took, his aura became stronger. When Eugene gradually approached the Shadow Lord, he took the white bone spear that was surrounded by the ancestral spirit's light from his back. His whole body could not help but exude a wild aura. A faint shadow appeared behind him. It was the incarnation of the half-orc's oldest ancestral spirits. They were once legendary figures of the half-orc race. With the power of the ancestral sacrifice, they gradually turned into powerful spirits. Demigod? The Shadow Lord's expression finally changed. Compared to Princess Royal, who did not reveal her divine power, Divine Ascender Eugene's body had obvious demigod characteristics. This power was obtained by Eugene after killing the Lesser Demon Lord. Compared to the divine power hidden in Princess Royal's blood, Divine Ascender Eugene's divine power from the bottomless abyss was more violent. At this moment, Eugene, who had activated all his power, had a trace of the evil god of the abyss. A true god, a demigod, and a mortal who was about to become a god. When Soren, Princess Royal, and Eugene surrounded the Shadow Lord, his expression finally changed. This was because even if he was an intermediate divine power, He would not be able to survive being surrounded by so many enemies. More importantly, there was one more thing. These three enemies all had a strong godly power on them. Chapter 8:22. The Lord of Shadows was a confident and scheming god. He liked to plan all kinds of secret plots, although his plans could easily put himself in danger. The Lord of Shadows was alert and cold. He never lost control of his emotions and his appearance was always changing. Therefore no one knew his true face. Soren was now facing his true body. Usually, in the eyes of the believers in the outside world, the Lord of Shadows was always changing. Many people were afraid of the Church of the Lord of Shadows, not only because of its cruelty, but also because of its hobby of stealing and lurking in the shadows. Most outsiders thought that the Church of the Lord of Shadows was just a thieves' union organized in the name of religion. Note, this is very true. The priests of the Lord of Shadows often worked as assassins, bards, divine power seekers, thieves, shadow sorcerers, shadow dancers and so on. Speaking of which, the Lord of Shadows was also a very unlucky god. This was because his predecessor had offended the chaos demon dog, Kozerv. Although the original god of thieves, Max, had fallen, the Lord of Shadows still inherited this hatred. Furthermore, the Lady of the Night was always eyeing him covetously. Only God knew how much Lady Shar wanted to take over the shadow priesthood, so he had been hiding ever since he became a god, not daring to show his true face. The Lord of Shadows was a very rich god, but his interpersonal relationship was not very good. He had always been hostile to the goddess of wealth. Is that all? Facing Soren and the others surrounding him, a sarcastic smile appeared on the Lord of Shadows' face. Then he slowly pulled out a long sword. Buzz. The long sword trembled violently the moment it came out of the sheath. The Lord of Shadows did not seem to think of this, and his expression was quite strange. As for Soren's reaction, it was much more intense. His expression changed almost instantly. His expression seemed to be a little excited and fanatical. At the same time, his face was slightly pale at first, and then it became a strange red color. God Slayer? Soren almost instantly recognized the weapon because he had tried to find it before, but it was after the Avatar crisis. God Slayer? Upon hearing Soren's words, Princess Royal's expression changed immediately. She immediately cast several defensive spells on herself. However, Eugene, the Divine Ascender, was a little slow in reacting. The name of the God Slayer was a little scary, but Eugene was not knowledgeable enough to understand the significance of the sword, so he could only remain vigilant. Seeing Soren's shocked expression, the Shadow Lord said with a hint of mockery, "I didn't expect you to recognize this sword." Of course they knew each other. How could Soren not recognize the god-slaying sword? After all, the sword had a lot to do with him. The story had to start from the first Avatar crisis. A long time ago there was a large-scale Avatar crisis in the material plane. At that time, many gods also fell to the mortal world for some reason. One of the masterminds was the core of the gods in the evil camp at that time, which was the original three gods of death. The former god of the Shadow Lord, who was known as the god of thieves at that time, turned himself into a divine weapon in order to avoid the danger of the Avatar crisis. That was the legendary God Slayer. This sword fell into the hands of Sirik, who was still immortal at that time. That was the god of murder, who was now sealed because of his madness. Sirik, who was still immortal at that time, used this sword to kill Baal, one of the three gods of death. He was the origin of all the God Slayer. Not only Soren's bloodline power, but as early as the end of the last time of troubles, Baal's bloodline had set off a huge storm in the material plane. In the end, it even forced the gods in the upper plane to make a judgment. In a way, the bloodline of the God Slayer started because of this God Slayer. Baal foresaw his own death at that time, so many God Slayer were born. After that, the god of thieves, Mexer, betrayed the goddess of shadows, Lila, to Sirik, so that the god of murder could obtain the clergy of shadows. But later, the god of thieves went further and further on the road of seeking death. He became the victim of the god of murder as madness. He also read the book that could be called a taboo and finally lost the clergy of conspiracy. Of course, what was worse was that Mexer later provoked the chaos demonic hound Kozerv. If it weren't for this series of events, perhaps the current Shadow Lord wouldn't have risen. It was because the god of thieves in the past was too reckless. In the end, the clergy was divided into two, and the Shadow Lord was born. I didn't expect the God Slayer to be in your hands. Soren's expression was unprecedentedly serious and he said slowly, It seems that the death of the previous god of thieves was not that simple. The Godslayer was definitely not a fake. As a son of murder, Soren could feel the power on it. This divine weapon had the divine power of slaughter. When the god of murder used this sword to kill Baal, the divine weapon that the god of thieves turned into also gained a lot of benefits. Other things could be deceived, but the power of the bloodline of slaughter could not be deceived. You mean this? The Shadow Lord gently waved the weapon in his hand, and a powerful divine power immediately burst out. He smiled contemptuously and said, "Mexer's soul has been imprisoned by me. Since he likes to become a weapon so much, I might as well refine him into a divine weapon forever." It was no wonder that the Lady of Night could hold back for so long. The Godslayer even killed Baal, who was one of the 3 gods of death. If this weapon could kill the 3 gods of death, it could also kill some powerful existences. For an ancient deity like the Lady of Night, any action that risked her life was not worth it. Be careful of this weapon. Soren's voice rang in the minds of the other 2. He said slowly, "The Godslayer once killed the god of murder, Baal. I don't know how much power this divine weapon still retains. But you guys still have to be careful in the upcoming battle." A mistake. Soren realized that he had made a small mistake. Although he did not guess the Shadow Lord's strength wrongly, he did not expect a weapon like the Godslayer to still exist in the multiverse. There was definitely a problem with the fall of the previous god of thieves, Mexer. Logically speaking, the Godslayer should have disappeared with him. But now was not the time to think so much. Although Soren did not expect this, he was not completely without confidence. This was because he had made other preparations from the very beginning. In his extra-dimensional space, there was another divine weapon that could fight against the Godslayer. Although Soren felt that it was quite difficult to fight with this weapon. Chapter 8:23. The Shadow Lord took the initiative. But the target was not Soren, but the weakest of the 3, Princess Royal. She was the only one who did not exude an obvious divine aura. Since Princess Royal had used some means to disperse the excess divine power in her body, her control of power had become more and more subtle. Unlike in the past, she could not perceive the violent divine power in her body at a glance. No matter from which point of view, the Shadow Lord's choice was not wrong. After all, Princess Royal was the most threatening spellcaster. But he obviously did not expect that Princess Royal's strength was actually stronger than Soren's. If it was a one-on-one fight, Soren and Princess Royal's chances of winning were about 4 to 6, and Princess Royal had at least a 20% higher chance of winning. Ice Prison. Even someone as powerful as the Princess Royal did not dare to be careless in the face of the Shadow Overlord, who wielded the Godslayer. She instantly distanced herself from the Shadow Overlord, and at the same time, cast a large number of defensive spells on herself. Then she activated the divine power of ice in her body and directly froze all the land in front of her. A piece of frost spread rapidly at a speed visible to the naked eye. The whole space seemed to have entered the extreme north all of a sudden, and even the space seemed to be frozen. Soren and Eugene's reaction speed was also very fast. As soon as the Shadow Lord moved, Eugene roared, and then the shadow behind him overlapped with his figure. In an instant, the whole person was like a god with a glimmer of divine brilliance. Heroic spirit fusion. In the past, Eugene was not enough to enter the demigod state, and naturally could not fully accommodate the power of the heroic spirit. But now, after absorbing the divine power of the lesser demon lord, he could no longer be regarded as an ordinary demigod. The white bone spear roared out. With a huge power that could destroy the world, Eugene threw the spear in his hand directly. In an instant, it broke through the space and made a sharp sonic boom. The next moment, the location where the Shadow Lord was located seemed to have been bombed by a missile, and a huge crater appeared directly. Eugene is already so strong? Soren's pupils slightly shrank and he couldn't help being surprised. He had absorbed the power of a lesser demon overlord before. There was an unlucky guy who was bewitched by the Queen of Spiders to absorb a lesser demon lord. Unfortunately, that guy was too weak and was controlled by the Queen of Spiders. As a hero who rose from the grassroots, Eugene's will naturally couldn't be measured by common sense. Perhaps he had completely suppressed the backlash of the secondary demon overlord's power. Ancient ancestral spirits. Heed my call. Eugene the Divine Ascender chanted in the ancient orc language. Then the illusions of heroic spirits appeared behind him again, but this time there were more of them. More than 10 legendary heroic spirits appeared behind him, providing him with endless power. Eugene was about to become a god. Based on Eugene's current strength, Soren was sure that Eugene had mastered the half-orc domain, which meant that he could control all the half-orc ancestral spirits. Once Eugene became a god, all of these ancestral spirits would become Eugene's oracles. The power brought by the ancestral spirits of the orcs for thousands of years was amazing. If Eugene could take these powers as his own, then it was very likely that he would directly be promoted to a lesser divine power. Because so far he was the only orc who had the potential to become a god. In this way, if Eugene became a god, he would become the only god of the orcs. The only god of the race was destined to be stronger than other new gods. Divinity power, to change space. Divinity power, to change reality. As the number one meat shield among the three, Eugene rushed forward and intercepted the Shadow Lord. The three of them had already studied the tactics of how to deal with the Shadow Lord. Eugene was naturally an irreplaceable meat shield, and Princess Royal was the main damage output against the Shadow Lord. As for Soren's role, the core was still to use the divinity power to confront the Shadow Lord. He must use the divinity power to offset the suppression ability of the Shadow Lord. Only when the divinity power of the true gods collided could the other two have a chance to attack. In the blink of an eye, Eugene and the Shadow Lord had exchanged hundreds of moves. As expected of an existence that could fight against the ancient brass dragon as soon as he appeared, Eugene's ability to fight head-on completely surpassed Soren's. And because there was a super meat shield in front, Princess Royal also had time to cast spells calmly. Although Soren was just wandering around, his divine power value was constantly decreasing because he could offset the Shadow Lord's divinity realm. Only by using the divinity power to seal the Shadow Lord's ability to jump between planes could others attack this dangerous enemy. Melf's Minute Meteor. Eugene's current state was not bad. Although the Shadow Lord's immunity to physical damage was very high, Princess Royal's spells were still effective. Soren used Melf's Minute Meteor to harass and attack while always looking for opportunities to use big moves. The balance of the battle was tilting. The three of them joined forces to besiege the Shadow Lord. Even if the other party had the legendary God Slayer in his hand, his situation was getting worse. But an accident happened just as the battle was about to tilt. Crack. The three people who had the upper hand suddenly turned into a disadvantage because of one thing. Eugene's weapon was broken. Just as the three of them joined forces to beat the Shadow Lord until he was more and more powerless to resist, the white bone spear in Eugene's hand was suddenly cut off by the Shadow Lord after a parry. The situation became very dangerous in an instant. Shadow Clone. The figure of the Shadow Lord split into three in an instant, and three identical Shadow Lords appeared in front of Soren. Immediately afterward, the other two figures of the Shadow Lord rushed from two sides and directly besieged Eugene, who had been entangled with him. The next moment, Eugene's old and burly body shook, and the two avatars of the Shadow Lord directly waved the God Slayer into Eugene's heart. Real avatars. The two avatars of the Shadow Lord were real shadow beings. With the white bone spear cut off, Eugene could not avoid the enemy's attack at all. Then the Shadow Lord mercilessly pierced his heart. Pucci. A stream of blood gushed out. Eugene, who was stabbed in the heart by the enemy, did not die because of this. His strong vitality still made him stand. This was the power of the legendary ability, Epic Toughness. Even fatal damage could not kill him. Eugene, who was stabbed in the heart, seemed to have stimulated the madness in his heart. He did not care and just roared and grabbed the God Slayer that pierced his heart with his bare hands. A terrible power broke out. After all, the Shadow Lord was only strong in agility. The weapon was grabbed by Eugene and could not be pulled out. Chapter 824. Eugene had experienced countless battles in her life. As one of the most powerful half-orcs in history, Eugene the Ascender had faced countless powerful enemies in her life. She had escaped from death more than once or twice, and she had been beaten to the brink of death more than once. This kind of battle experience far exceeded that of other professions, which gave Eugene the Ascender too many abilities, and legendary endurance was undoubtedly one of the most important legendary abilities. Although Eugene was very old and was about to reach the end of her life, the legendary abilities that she had honed through countless battles still gave her the ability to be immune to instant death damage. Being directly hit in the heart by the Shadow Lord didn't kill her, but it did cause a lot of damage to her. This was the terrifying ability of a melee fighter in the later stages. Some of the pure-blooded legendary warriors had epic strength, legendary tenacity, perfect constitution, and so on. Even if their hearts were taken out, they would still be able to stand tall, let alone be pierced through by the enemy. At this time they were no longer ordinary people and their weak points were no longer fatal. Just like Eugene now, although she was continuously bleeding, she could still continue to fight until her life force was exhausted. Rage. The fatal damage caused Eugene to enter a state of rage. Her eyes turned red, and blue veins appeared on her burly body like earthworms. Her tough muscles sealed the wound, and even though her heart was pierced, blood didn't continue to flow out of her wound. This kind of physical control was something that even Soren couldn't compare to. Eugene had developed the potential of his physical body to a jaw-dropping level. There was only one way to directly kill a top war shaman like him in the war material plane. And that was to chop off her head. Of course, Eugene wouldn't let the Shadow Lord chop off her head, and Soren and Princess Royal wouldn't give the Shadow Lord such a chance either. At this moment Eugene was like a rock standing upright. She held the Shadow Lord's Godslayer tightly with both hands, and at the same time, the half-orc ancestor soul behind her turned from an incorporeal body to a real body, holding a strange spear in its hand and stabbing towards the Shadow Lord. He was ready to risk his life. When the heart was stabbed, even a god in the form of a saint would not be able to hold on for too long. Although Eugene was still standing, he would quickly enter a state of near death with the loss of his vitality. We can't wait any longer. Soren didn't expect the battle to end so quickly. If Eugene was killed by the Shadow Lord, things would be very bad for them. Without hesitation, Soren pulled out a long sword that was surrounded by holy light. There was a sharp pain. The pain was even worse than when Soren used the Holy Avenger, because he was holding the divine weapon Pale Justice. The divine gear's repulsion towards Soren was even stronger. Even with the omnipotent hands, he was unable to counteract the pain that seeped into his soul. A silver-white light appeared. Soren held the silver sword of Gith in one hand and Pale Justice in the other. He instantly entered slaughter form and rushed directly to the Shadow Lord in front of him. Greater haste. Perfect dual-wielding battle. Whirlwind. Under the storm-like attack, Soren's whole body turned into a shadow. Only the real Ki could be seen raging out. The holy light and the silver-white light turned into a sky curtain that directly covered Shadow Lord. It was not the Holy Avenger. In this kind of battle, Soren did not choose the Holy Avenger because it was a two-handed greatsword. Using it forcibly would not be able to exert his true combat power. However, Pale Justice was different. It was a one-handed long sword, which perfectly matched Soren's dual-wielding ability. Only Pale Justice could let Soren exert the legendary ability of perfect dual-wielding battle, and increase his attack speed to the limit in an instant. Da. Little sparks appeared wildly. Shadow Lord's expression seemed to have a trace of horror because he felt severe pain when he was hit by Soren. Shadow Lord's voice seemed to have a trace of panic. He said, "Pale Justice. How is it possible? As an evil god, how can you use Pale Justice?" Soren did not answer, because at the moment he was also tortured by a kind of pain in his soul. As one of the most powerful artifacts in the material plane, Pale Justice was very repulsive to him. That was to say, he could still use it forcibly. If it were someone else, the holy damage would have severely injured the user. In more serious cases, it might directly change a person's alignment and cause them to be distorted. Icebound Kingdom. Princess Royal finally released the spell that she had been preparing for a long time. The surrounding space was completely blocked at once. A trace of the aura of the Kingdom of God emerged. The power of the Shadow Realm was covered, and Soren's divine power was also suppressed. Princess Royal's figure was suspended in mid-air, and there were pieces of crystal snowflakes falling around her body. Her eyes were a trace of golden divine light, and her whole person looked like a snow goddess in the cold winter. She raised her hand and pointed at Shadow Lord in front of her, and then the surging power of snow swept out like a torrent. Frost emerged. Unlike the frost that had already appeared on the ground, this time, the Shadow Lord's body was also covered in frost. He was an energy body in the form of a shadow. According to normal theory, this form of body could not be affected by the power of ice, but what happened now subverted this point. Shadow Lord's twisted body was freezing little by little. In the blink of an eye, his whole body was covered with a layer of frost. His body, which was almost immune to physical attacks, was also forcibly turned into a solid ice sculpture. Divine shock wave. How could Soren give up such a good opportunity? All the divine power in his body was squandered in an instant, directly turned into a pure shock wave, enveloping Shadow Lord in it. Shadow Lord had no physical body. So Princess Royal used her divine power to mobilize the power of ice and snow to create a physical body for him. And as long as he had a physical body, then under Soren's storm-like attacks, there was no possibility that he would not be broken. Crack. Cracks appeared on the body of Shadow Lord. His whole body shattered like an ice sculpture. The originally twisted shadow body was torn apart, and then a group of twisted shadows appeared. After Soren completely tore it apart, they still gathered little by little, as if they wanted to put the body together again. Divine Shock Wave. Ice Fortress. Ancestral Spirit Possession. The broken body of Shadow Lord was gradually recovering, but how could Soren and the others give the enemy a chance to resurrect? Without any hesitation, the three of them activated their own divine power at the same time. Princess Royal waved her hand, and the shadow of a fortress appeared. It was a magnificent castle made of ice, standing on the top of a snowy mountain. It was not a physical existence, but more like a palace belonging to her in a certain country. The soul of Shadow Lord was instantly suppressed. The shadow energy that was about to gather together suddenly froze. The body of Eugene the Divine Ascender merged with all the ancestral spirits. At this moment, there was a divine light on his body. The power of the half-orc ancestral spirits forced him into a temporary divine form. Then he condensed a spear of divine power out of thin air and threw it directly at Shadow Lord. Boom. There was a violent explosion. Soren's divine shock wave and Eugene's spear of ancestral spirits erupted at the same time. The huge divine power completely tore apart the soul of Shadow Lord, and also turned his gradually gathering body into nothing. A little bit of golden light appeared. As the soul of Shadow Lord was torn apart, the God-Slayer fell with a clang, followed by a burst of divine power. The most dazzling divine light rushed toward Soren's body. The other part of the power that represented the luck domain surged towards the eldest princess. Although Shadow Lord was in charge of the shadow domain, he also had the luck domain. This power could not be absorbed by Soren or Eugene. In the end, it was all integrated into Princess Royal's body. Eugene's body was also surrounded by golden divine power. The three of them had the power of gods, so they could naturally absorb divine power. A row of data appeared in front of them. Killed, Shadow Lord, intermediate divine power. Extracting target's soul energy. You've received 4525,000 slaughter EXP. Target has divine power. Extracting target's divine power. You've received 80 divine power. Target has divine power. Extracting target's divine power. You've received 60 divine power. Domain fusion. Shadow domain has been upgraded. You've mastered the shadow domain. Domain fusion. Wanderer domain activated. You've mastered the thief domain. Domain fusion. You've received information about the crafty domain. You've received information about the crafty domain. You've received information about the crafty domain. You've mastered a new domain ability, crafty. Domain fusion. You've received information about the darkness domain. A series of crazy data appeared. With the gathering of a huge amount of divine power, Soren's figure suddenly became hazy. He had the Wanderer domain. Now that he had successfully killed the Shadow Lord, the shadow domain immediately began to fuse with him. The power of this domain was so huge. Even when Soren had just fused with it, it had completely suppressed his original main domain, half-elf. The power of the divine power had tilted, and Soren's main domain was shifting from half-elf to shadow and wanderer. P.S. Everyone can follow Futa's public WeChat account. Pirated readers can also support him through the account. Chapter 825. The power of the Shadow Lord was very powerful. As one of the old gods that had existed for thousands of years, the Shadow Lord's clergies were shadow, theft, and rogue. The power of these three clergies was very compatible with Soren. Needless to say, the Shadow Lord's clergy was naturally very powerful. Theft and rogue were even completely complementary to the rogue clergy. So Soren absorbed the power of these three clergies very easily. Among them, the rogue clergy was directly integrated into the rogue clergy because rogue was originally a basic profession in the rogue class. As for the theft clergy, it was completely an extension of the clergy. Soren could integrate this clergy without any difficulty. Next was the power of the Shadow Lord's domain. As a cunning god, the Shadow Lord had always been stealing the power of other domains. Why did the Lady of the Night want to kill him? Not only because the Shadow Lord had the shadow clergy, but more importantly he also had the darkness domain. So why did the Queen of Spiders also want to kill the Shadow Lord? The reason was simple. In addition to the darkness domain, the Shadow Lord also had the crafty domain and the luck domain. Incredible. In fact, as early as the birth of the Twin of Destiny, many gods had stolen the power of the Twin of Destiny. There were also many gods who had the luck domain. As for the crafty domain, it was needless to say. This was a powerful battle domain. The Queen of Spiders had always wanted to make up for her crafty domain and directly promote it to the level of a clergy. Now that Soren had mastered the crafty domain, he could directly remove the curse effect on the High Priest when he went back. Other than that, the Shadow Lord also had the evil domain, but the power of this domain was not absorbed by Soren. The reason was simple. Eugene the Divine was even more evil than Soren. Princess Royal's alignment was neutral good, while Soren's alignment was lawful evil. The Shadow Lord's alignment was neutral evil, and the Divine Eugene's alignment was neutral evil. The original Eugene should be very close to lawful evil, but after absorbing the power of the Lesser Demon Lord, his alignment had begun to deviate towards chaotic evil. In other words, Eugene was more compatible with the power of the evil domain than Soren. In terms of the degree of evil, Soren should be around 50 points, while Eugene had slaughtered a large number of half-elves and started many wars. Therefore, Eugene's evil deviation should be more than 300 points. There was no doubt that Eugene was much more evil than Soren. In that case, Eugene's compatibility with the evil realm was much higher than Soren's. The same part of the power that belonged to the evil realm was naturally transferred to Eugene. Eugene's harvest was also very rich. It wasn't just the power of divinity and domain. More importantly, with the death of the Shadow Lord, a part of his divinity had been transferred to Eugene along with the evil domain. He was now only one step away from becoming a god with the priesthood of half-orc. Clang. Following the death of the Shadow Lord, the first thing Soren did was to throw out Pale Justice. Whoosh. Soren stood still and took a deep breath. He then looked at his palm, which was already charred black. The battle didn't last long, but his palm was severely burned by the holy power. Pale Justice was much more powerful than the Holy Avenger. It was also less tolerant of evil. Soren was constantly receiving damage from it, and he was losing more than 10 holy damage every second. If the battle had dragged on any longer, he would have been heavily injured by this sword. The surroundings were dead silent. There was no time to talk. Although the three of them had successfully killed the Shadow Lord, Eugene was already in a state of near death. The situation was a bit strange. Princess Royal's expression seemed to be a bit hesitant. She had been silently observing Soren's expression. Eugene's expression was a bit more anxious. Her heart was pierced by the Shadow Lord during the battle. Although she was able to kill the Shadow Lord in the end, her strength was now less than 30%. In other words, Eugene was now very weak. As a tragic historical figure, Eugene's lifespan was about to reach its end. However, the Avatar crisis gave her an important opportunity. That was, she could seize this opportunity to become a god and completely get rid of the limit of her lifespan. Now the Shadow Lord was dead. As long as Eugene was given some time, she could successfully become a god. But the premise was that she was still alive. The atmosphere became very strange. Although no one spoke, they all realized one thing. That was, the contract between Soren and Eugene had been completed. At this time, if Soren turned hostile, it would be easy to kill Eugene, whose heart was severely injured and was about to die. Eugene didn't speak. As a legendary figure who struggled from the bottom to the present, although she was now seriously injured and dying, she didn't express her allegiance or other intentions to beg Soren to let her go. She just waited quietly, waiting to see how Soren would deal with her, who was now seriously injured and dying. Eugene had her own pride. She had led the half-orcs all the way to the present, and she was undoubtedly a strong person with strong beliefs. Soren was also facing a choice at this moment. Kill Eugene. Let Eugene go. If he killed Eugene, there was almost no difficulty now. He could get a lot of slaughter EXP and take away a lot of divinity and divinity, including the evil realm that had just been absorbed by Eugene. However, in this way Soren would also go back on his original promise. Although the effect of the contract had been completed after killing the Shadow Lord, he would have to pay the price of a little shift in alignment. But this price was completely incomparable to the gain. Killing Eugene could make Soren continue to improve his power. Time passed little by little. Soren didn't hesitate for too long. He slowly walked toward Eugene. When the old and determined half-orc in front of him saw him approaching, he obviously became nervous and could not help but clench the white-bone spear with divine power. It was impossible to say that she was not worried. If Soren went back on his promise at this time, then all of Eugene's efforts would be in vain. Greater restoration. Soren gave Eugene the answer with action. He did not launch an attack, but used the remaining divine power to cast greater restoration on Eugene. Of course, it was easy to kill Eugene at this time. But Soren was also a man with his own beliefs. He had his own bottom line, and his promise was more effective than the devil's contract. Since he had promised to cooperate with Eugene, he would never break his promise. Soren chose to give up. He gave up the temptation of a lot of slaughter exp and the power of divinity and divinity in Eugene. He chose to follow his promise. Because he was a man with a bottom line, even as a god, he maintained his own principles. He would not kill Eugene. At least not now. Maybe in the future the two would have conflicts in the Avatar crisis, causing Soren and Eugene to fight again, but at least he would never kill Eugene now. Because this was what he had promised. At this moment, Soren seemed to have gained a kind of sublimation. This kind of improvement was not in power but in spirit and faith. He resisted the temptation of the power increase brought by killing Eugene. This kind of spiritual and faith combination made Soren feel extraordinary. It was as if the spirit had been sublimated to a certain extent, and then merged with something very mysterious. At this moment, a row of data appeared. Law Fusion. You have gained some information about the ordered domain. All of this happened at the moment when Soren gave up on killing Eugene. A row of data suddenly appeared. Soren had gained information about the ordered domain, and Princess Royal, who had been silently observing him not far away, could not help but smile. No matter what. Even if she hated Eugene, she did not want Soren to suddenly kill him at this time. Because this kind of behavior was not what she wanted to see. P.S. Third update. I finished this paragraph in one breath. Chapter 826. His words and deeds were in harmony. When Soren finally made his decision, he suddenly had an illusion that he was in harmony with some kind of law, and then felt the power of some kind of law. No. This was not an illusion, because when he received the information from the ordered domain, Soren knew that he really felt the power of the law this time. And it was a very powerful ordered domain. All this time, Soren's promise was the most important thing in the Outer Islands. Why were so many pirates willing to follow Soren and risk their lives for him? Why didn't they even frown? Wasn't it because Soren was a man of his word, and he was a man of his word? This was order. But this kind of order was not enough because it did not have enough weight. After all, pirates were only mortals, and Soren was able to resist the temptation to kill Eugene, and chose to keep his promise. Then the meaning was completely different. Even if Soren killed Eugene, it would only shift his alignment slightly, and it would not shift to neutral evil. At most, it would shift from order to chaos by 30 to 50 points. But the benefits of killing Eugene were very shocking: millions of slaughter exp, and a lot of divinity and quintessence. The benefits and the price were not on the same level. But Soren still held on to his beliefs, and at this moment, his spirit seemed to have been sublimated. He suddenly thought of Father Oak, and understood why he sacrificed himself to save the natural world. Gods. Especially gods who had mastered certain laws. They were not only the executors of certain laws, but they were also the maintainers of such laws. So the Father Oak chose to sacrifice himself. He chose to use his life to protect the laws of nature. In the words of the Eastern world, the path that the Father Oak chose was sacrifice. The Father Oak was definitely not dead. Soren's understanding at this moment was not something that mere divinity and quintessence could bring, because the understanding in his heart directly opened up a broad path, and also allowed him to understand the root of greater divine power. Even this path might even lead to a greater divine power. The order was Soren's choice. At this moment he was enlightened, and a huge door was opened in his heart. A very ancient and powerful law of power was branded in the depths of his soul. Order. From today onwards, Soren would become the enforcer and protector of order. Although he was from the lawful evil faction in the past, it was only now that he had truly touched upon the roots of the law of order. The order of all things, the cycle of the heavenly Tao. Soren spoke slowly, but no one understood what he was saying because he wasn't speaking in the common language. It wasn't even the language of any of the races in this world because Soren was speaking Chinese. However, Everyone present understood this sentence because the power of the gods was called language proficiency. As soon as Soren finished speaking, suddenly the space around them began to vibrate. Then a golden light descended from the sky and entered Soren's body. The power of the law. This was the light of divinity, and it also brought Soren's understanding of order. After hearing Soren's words, Princess Royal couldn't help but fall into deep thought, and Eugene's expression seemed to be a little confused. But this was not the most important thing, because when Soren received this divinity, many of the gods in the order camp seemed to have sensed it, and they immediately looked up in the direction of Soren. At this moment they knew that the gods in the order camp had one more enforcer: chaos and order. For a long time the gods had been maintaining the operation of the multiverse, and the balance of the entire multiverse was created by the collision of chaos and order. Congratulations. Princess Royal gently came in front of Soren and congratulated him with a smile. It seems that you will become a greater divine power, sooner or later. I'm afraid that the gods in the pantheon will change in the future. Although Princess Royal couldn't understand Soren's language, she could understand the meaning behind it. Soren's meaning had already proved that he was interested in the most basic of laws. Basically, the gods who could obtain something in this domain would eventually become greater divine power. Soren smiled and nodded. Then he waved his hand and picked up the God Slayer. The sword fell into his hand and a strange blood-red light appeared. Then Soren felt a familiar bloodline power enter his body. This was the power of slaughter. The God Slayer still had Baal's divinity left on it, and perhaps it was because of this that it could be preserved. A row of data appeared in front of him. Discovered the remaining divinity of the God of Slaughter. Do you want to absorb it? Absorbing it may cause damage to the God Slayer. Without any hesitation, Soren chose to absorb it. The next moment, the God Slayer exploded with a dazzling divine light. This power all entered Soren's body, and the light on the God Slayer became weaker and weaker. In the end, there was only a trace of the divine weapon's light left. At this moment, a row of data appeared in front of Soren's eyes. Absorb the divinity of the God of Slaughter. The God Slayer is severely damaged. The Slaughter domain has been upgraded. You have been promoted from Son of Slaughter to Divine Son of Slaughter. You have obtained part of the information of the Slaughter domain. The power of the God Slayer completely dissipated. All the divine light on it merged into Soren's body, and in the end, the God Slayer almost became an ordinary weapon. However, a powerful force emerged from Soren's body. That was the power of slaughter. He extracted the divinity of the God of Slaughter, Baal, from the God Slayer, and used it to promote himself to the divine Son of Slaughter. He also obtained the information of the Slaughter domain, a top-grade divine weapon in the material plane, in exchange for the information of the Slaughter domain. Soren did not know if it was worth it or not. However, he relied on his identity as the Son of Slaughter to start his career. Strictly speaking, the potential of the Slaughter domain was much higher than the Shadow domain. The Shadow domain was a domain. However, the Slaughter domain belonged to the top-grade battle domain. More importantly, the Slaughter domain belonged to the core domain of the three death gods. This domain could be related to one of the origins of the multiverse. The Shadow Master was dead. The next step was much easier. The matter of taking over the Shadow Church and the Shadow Thieves Guild could be left to the High Priest. The most important thing for Soren now was to gather energy and break through to intermediate divine power in one go. Currently, his divinity had reached 222 points, and his divinity had reached 112 points. The Shadow Master and Soren's compatibility was too high. The amount of divinity and divinity absorbed after killing it far exceeded Soren's estimation. It was no wonder that the other gods liked to attack enemies with similar domains. Chapter 827. The reward for killing the Shadow Lord was amazing. Soren's legendary points, which hadn't increased for a long time, suddenly increased by 50 points. Because of the God Slayer, his legendary points had now reached an astonishing 200 points. God Slayer, Soren, epic background ability. You have successfully killed the Shadow Lord. After killing the god of the hunt, you have killed another ancient god. Your name has spread throughout the multiverse. Whether it's Mountain Paradise, the Bottomless Abyss, or the Bator Inferno, all the gods now know of your existence. They have a trace of respect for you and dare not easily make an enemy out of you. At the same time, your faith has begun to spread in the shadow plane. Legendary points plus 100, intimidation plus 200, negotiation plus 100. All of your trials of resistance will have an additional 2 God-Slayer points. After Soren had successfully killed another god, his intimidation skill had surpassed his stealth ability. Soren's stealth was currently at 505 points, but his intimidation had reached 575 points and his negotiation had reached 465 points. This was obviously a series of reactions, which meant that Soren's voice in the multiverse, especially among the gods, was now much more powerful than before. This kind of improvement was obtained through killing. Naturally, Soren didn't need to be responsible for the rest of the work. He only needed to wait for his subordinates to report it. However, before Princess Royal left, she said something very interesting to Soren. At that time she said, "Have you ever considered to be neutral? The king of the dead, Clemvox, was transferred to the neutral camp. If you do the same, I'm sure you'll have fewer enemies and avoid a lot of trouble." This sentence had a deep meaning. Princess Royal's camp was neutral good. In order to match the power of the goddess of snow and northern wind, she would most likely change her camp after she became a god in the future. Of course, the active camp change was much better than the passive camp change. The belief of the goddess of snow was spread all over the cold regions. There were believers of the evil camp and believers of the good camp. Therefore, Princess Royal's camp would definitely be neutral in the future. It was very likely that she wanted to change to the neutral camp. This way, as a new god, she would be able to avoid the confrontation between the evil and the good. Obviously. She also hoped that her relationship with Soren would be better after she became a god. At least, it wouldn't cause too serious of a conflict after she became a god. However, it was still a little presumptuous for her to say this personally. After all, the camp of the gods was not something that outsiders could interfere with. Soren was not suitable to change his camp at the moment. Instead of taking the initiative, it was better to let nature take its course, because he already had a clear direction in his heart. As for how his actions would affect the world in the end, he would leave this camp change to the multiverse and see what kind of feedback would be given to him. As for the king of the dead mentioned by Princess Royal, this was obviously an artificial camp change balance. A day passed in a blink of an eye. The conflict between Mordor City and the Shadow Church was basically over. Soren's victory meant that the Shadow Church would be annexed by Mordor City, and the Shadow Thieves Union would also be transferred to Mordor City. It was just that a lot of blood would be shed to clean up the situation. Soren's victory meant that all the rogues in Mordor City would get a chance to improve their strength. After Soren completely integrated the Shadow Priesthood, these rogues could directly access the Shadow Domain, and their own stealth and shadow abilities would be improved a lot. Moreover, Soren's priests and fanatics could directly obtain the legendary ability, Shadow Domain, after reaching the legendary realm. The improvement of the power of the gods could be fed back to the believers. The more priesthood domains Soren mastered, the more domains the believers could access, and their overall strength would be stronger than others. Maybe it was because of Soren's fighting style. Over the years, the direction of the rogues in Mordor City had also changed. First of all, the number of rogues who had advanced to Shadow Dancer had increased a lot, and then the fighting style was equivalent to the stealth, assassination and sneak attack of the past. Currently, the rogues in Mordor City preferred to train the ability to dodge, parry, move and so on. If you saw a person who was agile fighting with a burly warrior in the training ground of Mordor, you didn't have to doubt anything. This was definitely not an agile warrior, but an orthodox rogue. Soren's wild fighting style had changed the fighting style of the rogues below. Moreover, the rise of Soren meant that the rogues were not without the ability to fight head-on. Under the guidance of people, there was a new fighting style of rogues in Mordor City. People called this style of rogues Battle Thief. Dodge, parry, move. The biggest feature of this type of rogue was their speed, accuracy, and high evasion. Ugly Monkey was the representative of this type. He was not at a disadvantage at all when fighting head-on with warriors of the same level. In the end, this situation led the temple to start studying ways to train the ability of evasion. After defeating the Shadow Lord, the spoils of war were quickly calculated. As a church that started by stealing, the Church of the Shadow Lord was still very rich. Unfortunately, he had neither connections nor technology. Even if he had a lot of money, he could not convert it into direct combat power. In the end, it was all given to Soren. The Shadow Lord did not have a good relationship with other gods, and because of his theft, the goddess of wealth was very disgusted. Even if the Shadow Lord was very rich, it was difficult to convert it into combat power. First of all, the Northern Witch Council would definitely not trade with them, and then the Wizard Alliance would definitely wait and see because of Soren. No one would bet rashly at this point, so the money of the Shadow Lord could only buy trap materials in the end. The biggest difference between Soren and the Shadow Lord was that he had technology, capital, and foundation. His money could be converted into materials at any time and sent to the Golem factory. Money was combat power for Soren. As long as he had money, he could pull out another Golem army. The final statistics came out quickly. The High Priest took more than 1 million Kindler from the Shadow Lord and the Shadow Thieves Guild. This was the cash resources of the two forces. Other gems and metal materials, including some stolen goods, added up to about 3 million Kindler. Then there were all kinds of equipment, including some stolen goods. The initial value was estimated to be about 5 million Kindler. Finally, there were all kinds of antiques and artworks that were very difficult to sell and so on. The value was a little bit scary. The master, who was proficient in valuation, finally gave a price of 12 million Kindler. Because they found Queen Isabella's crown in the Shadow Thieves Guild, as well as the scepter that symbolized the Griffin dynasty and so on. The value of these things was amazing, but there was no way to sell them. Moreover, these were all King stolen goods. But anyway, Soren was now a rich man with a net worth of more than 10 million Kindler. PS, second update. Continue to ask for support on WeChat. Chapter 828. If it weren't for the Avatar crisis, Soren would be rich immediately. Unfortunately, now it was a time of turmoil. These valuable art collections were simply a pile of waste. The difficulty of getting rid of them was simply too high. They could only be used as collections. However, Soren had always been a pragmatist. After looking at the list of the collection, he waved his hand and ordered someone to hold an auction. Then the rest of the items were too valuable to be sold. He simply asked someone to make a museum exhibition and collect tickets. By the way, he would let the residents of Mordor see these legendary treasures that were priceless. In this way, it would be much easier for them to brag in the pub in the future. Since they were citizens of Mordor City, their bragging skills were definitely better than those in other places. Stealing was really a good way to make a fortune. It was a pity that Soren was unlikely to use the clergy of theft as his core, and this clergy was too hateful. The Shadow Lord's interpersonal relationships were so bad. The church was besieged by Soren and had no allies to help. The main reason was that the clergy of theft had attracted a lot of hatred over a long period of time. The role of Soren's clergy could only be used to allow his rogues to access the field of theft. In the future, it would definitely need to be separated like the half-elf clergy. Most of the income this time would go to the treasury of Mordor, but a part of the reward would still be given. Now that a big enemy was solved, Soren's position was much more stable. At present, looking at the entire material plane, there were almost no enemies that were in conflict with Soren's clergy and were quite dangerous. Although the Shadow Lord's clergy might attract the attention of Lady of the Night, for the time being, Lady of the Night was unlikely to attack Soren. This representative of the evil faction still had too many enemies to deal with. At present, Soren's remaining race gods, such as the halfling god of rogues and other gods with the same field, could be put aside for the time being. Soren's focus now turned to integrating the Shadow Lord's clergy. At the same time, while the third wave of the Avatar crisis had not broken out yet, he was ready to study how to use the war chess plane. The slaughter EXP gained from killing the Shadow Lords could also be used to increase his Arcanist level. The Arcanist profession has been raised to level 8. Received 37 INT 28 plus INT 28 to 10, *0. 5, skill points, HP increased by 13, profession HP 4 plus, con 28 to 10, *0. 5. Obtained 1 free attribute point. Obtained 1 talent point. The improvement from killing a deity was astonishing. Soren received a large amount of slaughter EXP. After leveling up his Arcanist class to level 8, Soren received a free attribute point and an ability point. There was nothing to think about. The free attribute points were allocated to intelligence, raising it to 29 points. At the same time, Soren chose legendary spell penetration. It was a legendary ability that spellcasters had to master. Legendary spell penetration, epic ability. Any of your spells will have an additional 6 points of spell penetration. When casting any spell, the test of immunity triggered will have an additional 6 points. This ability is effective against any spells. Because of this ability, it will be more difficult for the enemy to successfully resist against control spells. This effect automatically replaces the ability of spell penetration. The effect of this legendary ability was amazing. The 6 points of spell penetration was equivalent to the additional effect of 12 points of intelligence. Using a Finger of Death as an indicator, Soren's current intelligence was 29 points, and his level was 18. The additional value of intelligence was 9 points, and his level was 18 points. In addition to the effect of legendary spell penetration, the difficulty of Soren's Finger of Death had exceeded 35 points. Basically, for enemies below legendary strength, Soren could kill them in one shot with one move, Finger of Death. The same effect could also be used on Crowd Control, Disintegrate, and Disintegrate. However, Soren rarely used Disintegrate because this type of spell would not leave any loot. The enemy would be directly disintegrated together with their equipment. From the looks of it, because of the buff from the Intermediate Divinity and the Intermediate Divinity, as well as Arcane Mastery, Soren's spellcasting ability was finally starting to take shape. The strength of his spells was already equivalent to that of a purebred wizard above level 24. Arcanist has leveled up to level 9. Received 38 INT 29 plus INT 28 to 10, *0. 5, skill points, HP increased by 13, profession HP 4 plus, con 28 to 10, *0. 5. Arcanist has leveled up to level 10. Received 38 INT 29 plus INT 28 to 10, *0. 5, skill points, HP increased by 13, profession HP 4 plus, con 28 to 10, *0. 5. Leveled up to level 7. Received 1 free attribute point. Received 1 ability point. Soren used up all the slaughter EXP from the Shadow Lord, directly leveling up his Arcanist profession to level 10. At the same time, his intelligence increased to a shocking 30 points. There was almost nothing to think about. This ability point came from level 7. Soren directly chose Legendary Endurance. It couldn't be helped. When Eugene was pierced through the heart by the Shadow Lord, he was still able to stand. That was a huge shock to Soren. With Legendary Endurance, Soren's body didn't have any obvious weaknesses. Legendary Endurance, epic ability. Your body has surpassed the limits of mortals. From now on, even if your heart is hit by an enemy, you will not die. Unless the enemy chopped off your head, all physical damage would only cause you to lose HP. Legendary Endurance has completely changed your body. You will be immune to most lethal effects. At the same time, when Legendary Endurance is activated, the physical damage you receive will be temporarily reduced by 40%. Remarks, prerequisite, 25 Vitality. This was Eugene's ability at that time. Legendary Endurance gave the melee class a terrifying survivability. Most lethal attacks were ineffective. As long as Soren's HP wasn't depleted, he would be able to stand even if his heart was dug out. For a god like Soren who could cast divine spells, as long as he didn't die on the spot, a greater regeneration would be able to save him. If that was the case, the difficulty of killing him would be doubled. Soren was taking shape as a meat shield. Although he hadn't mastered perfect health and epic strength, Soren's current HP was close to 600 points. His survivability in a frontal battle was already higher than a purebred warrior above level 20. Currently, the total level of Soren's rogue was 20, and the total level of the spellcaster was also 20. No matter if it was magic or melee, he had already taken shape. He was finally about to reach the standard of a veteran god. He had the ability to crush any enemy below legendary. In other words, the enemies that were not above legendary were no longer a threat to Soren. P.S. Follow Futa's public WeChat support. There's an update today. Chapter 829. Time passed by day. After killing the Shadow Lord, Soren's figure seemed to have suddenly disappeared. The outside world didn't get any news about him. Instead, Gloria became active. At present, all the big and small things in Mordor City were basically handed over to her to deal with. Basically, everyone thought that Gloria had become the current ruler of Mordor City. She had gradually replaced Soren and stood on the stage of the secular power of Mordor City. The changes in Mordor City were still ongoing. Every day, new changes were taking place in Mordor City. Especially after the appearance of the alchemy cement developed by the Northern Witches, the changes in Mordor City were already very amazing. The roads were being repaved every day, and new tall and magnificent buildings were being built one after another. More and more witches were under Gloria's command. Even wizards from other places came to visit her, hoping to get some knowledge of the arcane empire from Mordor City. The changes in the temple also continued. During this period of time, the temple held a large prayer ceremony almost every day, and the divine brilliance above the temple became more and more dazzling. Finally, when this divine brilliance reached a critical point, a golden beam of light rose into the sky. Immediately, Sorin's figure emerged in midair. It was a golden hazy figure, looking down on the entire city of Mordor. This was Sorin's divine form, which would only appear when he was promoted to intermediate divine power. Central Square. Thousands of believers gathered in the square. They were divided into 3 camps. One was the judiciary, which was mainly composed of lurkers and assassins. The other was the center, which was mainly composed of saint priests and other special professions. The last was the bishops, most of whom were the core priests of the church. Behind them was a mass of believers. At this moment, they were kneeling on the ground devoutly, holding a huge prayer ceremony. My Lord Sorin, you are the master of the shadows. You are the master of Mordor. You are the protector of the half-elves. My Lord Sorin, you are the keeper of order. You are the only true god of the rogues. Your enemies will have nowhere to hide. My Lord Sorin, your name will become sacred in the mortal world. You have led us through this crisis. You have given us a stable and orderly life. You are the master of the shadows. You are a wise ruler. You are the protector of the half-elves. Slaughter will make you stronger. The enemy's death spreads your glory. Your kingdom will protect our souls. When death comes, the servants who serve you will be reborn in your kingdom. My Lord Sorin, you will raise the kingdom that belongs to you, transforming into the stars in the sky. Surging divine power converged. Sorin's divine power was released from his divine spirit form and spread to all the believers in the central square. The power of the shadow domain was spreading. All of Sauron's followers were nourished by traces of divine power, making them feel incomparably warm and enveloped by a massive amount of power. Most of this power was distributed to Sorin's core believers. The rogues received the most obvious improvement. Almost every rogue's shadow and stealth abilities were improved. Then came the priest's divine power. They could access more realms, and there were more divine spells such as summon shadow beings and dispel shadow beings. Finally, there were the ordinary believers. They only received a little bit of divine power to improve their basic skills a little bit. This was the god's feedback. When Sorin successfully advanced to intermediate divine power, all his believers received a significant improvement. At this time, Sorin's prayers had undergone a huge change. The first prayer was no longer half-elves, but Master of Shadows. This meant that Sorin's core divine power had changed from half-elves to shadow. The order of the prayers represented Sorin's current abilities. Half-elves, order, domination, rogues, and tracking. Sorin had changed from the god that the rogues served to the only true god of the rogues. This represented his ambition to unify the rogues' divine power, and his enemies had nowhere to hide. This represented the power of tracking. The only thing that did not appear was theft. There was no theft in the prayers. This meant that Sorin was announcing to all the forces in the mortal world, including the other gods, that even if he had the rogue's divine power, he would not use theft as a part of spreading his faith. He was not a thief. He would not let the rogues who believed in him steal. This was an expression of his attitude. Finally, there was the core part of the prayers. Sorin used to become holy among the half-elves, but now the core prayer was your name will become holy among the mortals. This meant that Sorin had officially entered the competition of the gods. He no longer limited his faith to the half-elves, but intended to spread his faith to the whole multiverse. This was a kind of declaration. Sorin would completely get rid of the limitations of his race's divine power. He would no longer have the half-elves as his core believers. Instead, he would include all races in the scope of his faith. This was a behavior that attracted hatred. But for Sorin, it was a process that he had to go through because he was already a middle divine power. If he was still limited to his race, there was almost no possibility for him to continue to improve in the future. This was something that could not be helped. The population of the half-elves was limited. It was impossible for the half-elves to become a greater divine power alone, and it was not very beneficial for the development of Sorin's other divine powers. At present, Getting rid of the limitations of his race's divine power as soon as possible could make Soren stronger. The sacred ceremony was still going on. Soren was gathering the power of faith of his believers, and then connecting to the original divine kingdom and the divine kingdom of the shadow plane. One was the divine kingdom of the half-elves, and the other was the divine kingdom of the shadow. This was Soren's power, and it was also the kingdom that he needed to inherit and integrate in the future. This would be a very big process. Soren had to first descend the half-elves' divine kingdom to the shadow plane, and then integrate the two divine kingdoms. The half-elves' divine kingdom was under the protection of the elven divine system, and its coordinates were close to the wild field, in the upper plane. The divine kingdom of the Shadow Lord was in the shadow plane, and it belonged to the space close to the lower plane. Soren was now descending the half-elves' divine kingdom to the shadow plane. Descending the divine kingdom. This was a very big project and Soren had to pay a lot of divine power. However, when the two divine kingdoms were integrated, his power would be even stronger. Chapter 830. A sacred light shrouded the whole city of Mordor. Soren's promotion to mid-level divine power was very big, and it might even be bigger than his ascension because the power of a mid-level divine power was enough to affect a kingdom. In the position of the port of Mordor, the figure of the goddess of wealth appeared again. This time her divine avatar was more condensed. It seemed that because Soren killed her enemy, the Shadow Lord, or maybe because Soren was about to catch up with her power, the avatar of the goddess of wealth personally appeared to congratulate Soren on his promotion to a mid-level divine power. The appearance of the goddess of sea was not too late. Mordor was one of her important places to spread her faith. In the face of Soren's promotion, she also appeared to congratulate him. Outside the material plane. With the fluctuation of Soren's divine power, the half-elven kingdom in the upper plane began to slowly fall. Originally, before Soren ascended, the kingdom fell because of the fall of the original half-elven god and the god of rogues. Although it was temporarily stabilized because of Soren's power, it was close to the upper plane. Now that Soren had taken Shadow as his main divine power, then according to the laws of the gods in the multiverse, Soren's kingdom should be close to the shadow plane. At present, when Soren was promoted to a mid-level divine power, the whole half-elven kingdom was gradually falling towards the shadow plane. This kingdom would be relatively slow, but it would reach the shadow plane in at most half a year. At that time, Soren would receive the kingdom of the Shadow Lord and the half-elven kingdom at the same time. How to integrate these two kingdoms would be the problem he had to face at that time. With the end of the turbulent torrent at the beginning, Soren's power gradually became gentle. He had successfully broken through the barrier of mid-level divine power. After breaking through a certain critical point, Soren's mastery of divine power became more and more skillful. All his power rippled like ripples, constantly nourishing his believers and leaving a soul mark on them. This was the mark left behind by Soren. Now that it was the time of the Avatar crisis, the souls of the dead believers might not be able to reach Soren's holy kingdom normally. If they couldn't reach Soren's holy kingdom, the souls of the evil believers under Soren's command were very likely to fall to the lower planes, such as the bottomless abyss, the grey wilderness, the Bator Inferno, the scorching hell and so on. This would be a tragic outcome for the believers, and it would be a huge loss for Soren as well. That was why he had to leave a soul mark on these devout believers so that he could bring their souls back to his holy kingdom in case anything happened to them. This way, even if they died, they would still be able to obtain a better place to belong. The ripples of divine power gradually spread out. Soren's power flowed through the entire island of Mordor like water, and then connected with the temples of all the towns. Some kind of power shrouded the island of Mordor, and then it disappeared little by little. When Soren's divine light disappeared, a row of data appeared before his eyes, promoted to intermediate divine power. The power of divinity has been promoted. The form of the saint has been strengthened. You've gained a new ability, instant cast circle 1 to 3 spells. Why was it so difficult for mortals to kill a greater divine power? Looking at Soren's current ability, it was clear. Soren had just promoted to an intermediate divine power, and he had automatically gained the power of divinity for all the circle 1 to 3 spells. This was a specialty ability other than instant cast. Soren didn't have to spend more advanced spell slots to memorize, but he could directly cast all the circle 1 to 3 spells with the original spell slots. If this ability was obtained through the normal way, first one would need to obtain the legendary ability of instant cast circle 0 spells, then the legendary ability of instant cast circle 1 spells, and then the ability to strengthen to circle 3 spells. This required a total of 3 talent points. The eldest princess had this kind of instantaneous ability, but she relied more on herself to obtain and upgrade it. At this time, Soren's data had changed. Name: Soren, Saint Form, Intermediate Divine Power, Race, Half-Elf, Massacre God's Child, Attributes: Strength 23 plus 6, Dexterity 38 plus 6, Constitution 28 plus 6, Intelligence 30 plus 7, Wisdom 21 plus 6, Charm 25 plus 9. Alignment: Lawful Evil Profession, Level 10 Rogue 01150000, Level 10 Shadow Dancer, Max, Level 10 Wizard, 02175000, Level 10 Arcanist, 02455000, Grade 7, Health Points, 585585, Sturdy, Experience Points, 355075, Slaughter EXP, 17,545, Profession EXP, Unassigned Skill Points, None Attribute Points, None Legend Level, 200 Divinity, 222 Intermediate Divinity, requires 300 points to upgrade, Greater Divinity. Divinity, 112, Intermediate Divinity. Requires 300 points to upgrade, Greater Divinity. Divine Power, 313240, requires 1200 Divine Power to upgrade to Intermediate Divine Power. Master, Deity's Descent, Divine Law. The current Divinity storage limit is 2,240 points. Clergy, Shadow, Theft, Half-Elf, Rogue, Tracking Domain, Trickery, Slaughter, Death, Fear, Evil, Rule, Piracy, Shadow, Plant Spiritual Energy, Evil Spiritual Energy, Fear Spiritual Energy Status. Normal Basic Skills, Sneak 505, Literacy 375, Steal 325, Pick Lock 315, Snare 275, Focus 275, Negotiate 465, Appraise 225, Deceive 275, Intimidation 575, Taunt 275, Perform 215, Listen 365, Dodge 325, Parry 215, Block 175, Heal 215, Search 375, Detect 375, Copy Scroll 185, Spell Identification 255, Survival 325, Use Magic Equipment 185, Cooking 125, Alchemy 275, Forge Magic Weapon 235. Saint Form. Transcendence, Spell Immunity 1 to 4, Epic Divine Power, Instant Cast 1 to 3. Divinity Abilities, Space Change, Death's Hand, Reality Change, Form Change, Divine Power Shockwave, Language Proficiency, Character Proficiency, Interplanar Communication, Astral Teleportation, Plane Teleportation. Legendary Skills, Legendary Tenacity, Legendary Spell Penetration, Legendary Reflex, Detect Weakness, Perfect Dual Wielding, Omnipotent Hands, Legendary Evasion, Legendary Battle Skills, Epic Dexterity, Epic Intelligence, Epic Constitution. Special Abilities, Blessing of the Goddess of Magic, God Slayer, Blessing of the Misfortune Goddess, Blessing of the Sea Goddess, Dragon Blood Baptism LV2, Heart of Slaughter, Slayer, Death Walker, Ascetic, Erudite, Blasphemy. Personal Abilities, Nimble Left Hand, Eidetic Memory, Perseverance, Encyclopedic Knowledge, Spellcasting Proficiency, Reflex Evasion, Intuitive Evasion, Roll Evasion, Agile Movement, Evade Sight, Dark Vision, Combat Spellcasting, Mobile Spellcasting, Spell Control, Empower Spell, Maximize Spell, Craft Magical Equipment, Spell Penetration, Minor Spell Resistance, Minor Cold Resistance, Medium Fire Resistance, Minor Poison Resistance, Minor Electric Resistance, Robust, High Regeneration, Telepathy. 100 feet. Profession Abilities, Arcane Memory, Arcane Counterspell, Arcane Runes, Shadow Dominator, Nimble Mind, Military Weapon, Proficiency, Curved Sword, Legendary. Battle Skills, Summon Shadow, Shadow Jump, 300 meters, Shadow Strike, Shadow Jump, 2 times, Vampiric Touch, Divine, Sword Form, Heavy Hack, Sword Form, Horizontal Slash, Sword Form, Beheading, Sword Form, Waist Chop, Sword Form, Spinning Strike, Spinning Slash. The foundation is gradually stabilizing. Soren's figure slowly disappeared in midair and then reappeared in the Great Temple. Now that he had advanced to the mid-level divine power, his own strength had improved again. There was not much difference between him and the old gods. Now even his basic skills were gradually catching up. His core skills had reached more than 300 or 400 points, and even his other skills had reached 100 or 200 points. The strengthening of various basic abilities was almost done. In the future, the focus would be on the legendary abilities. My lord. With the completion of Soren's advancement to the mid-level divine power, the prayer ceremony outside gradually ended, and the figure of the high priestess appeared in front of Soren. Soren turned to look at her and said, "It's time. I'll help you remove the curse left by the Queen of Spiders." When the high priestess heard this, her expression was a little excited, and then she stood in place very respectfully. Arcane domain. Saint form. A golden light appeared on Soren's body, and his whole person seemed to be shrouded in the light of divinity. He slowly reached out and pressed on the head of the high priestess, and then he saw a power full of evil aura emerging. This power twisted and turned into a ferocious spider mark, and then it screamed and was expelled by Soren's divine power. The emblem of the Queen of Spiders. When the power of the arcane domain was completely expelled by Soren, the twisted spider mark also disappeared completely, but it was certain that the Queen of Spiders was aware of it. She was currently fighting with the elven gods, so she should not be in a hurry to trouble Soren. Everything in Mordor was gradually on the right track. Soren's advancement to the mid-level divine power did not bring much pressure to the other gods because he killed gods who were almost alone, and these gods' relationships were very poor. More importantly, there was one more thing. At present, the power of all the gods in the Pantheon Temple was united. Even gods like the Queen of Spiders knew how to cultivate a few gods to form their own drow divine system. For a god like Soren who fought alone, even if he was promoted to greater divine power, it was difficult for him to threaten those who were really high up. There was no divine power. It was simply not enough to rely on one person because even if a god was very powerful, how many places could he go? Once the conflict between gods escalated, it would eventually evolve into a struggle between gods. Elven divine system. Dwarf divine system. Orc divine system. Halfling divine system. Nature divine system. Glory divine system. Death divine system. Looking at the row of names above, it could be seen that Soren's power might be really strong in the mortal world. But if this kind of power was brought to the Pantheon Temple, it would be nothing at all. Any divine system had the ability to completely crush Soren. The key was only whether they were willing to pay such a big price. If it were not for the outbreak of the Avatar crisis at this time, there should have been gods trying to win over Soren. After all, a new god rising quickly could still enrich the power of their own divine system. But now was a turbulent time, and there were many internal conflicts in many divine systems. At this time, no one had the energy to win over Soren. Moreover, Soren was currently in the evil camp, and his ability was inclined to be alone. Except for the evil gods led by Lady of Night, most of the other divine systems did not like Soren's clergy. But the problem was that Lady of Night was very eager to live in the shadow clergy, which meant that it was difficult for the two to be together. It was so awkward for a god to be alone. This was not only the case for Soren but also for the sea goddess. Why was the sea goddess always suppressed by the Storm Lord? It was not because the Storm Lord had subordinate gods, but the subordinate gods cultivated by the sea goddess were just weak, and some of them were simply demigod-level creatures. If there was a war with the Storm Lord, then it would definitely be a full-scale war. In this case, the sea goddess would not be able to do anything. If it were not for this reason, the sea goddess would not spend so much energy to create the sea divine system. This was also a problem that Soren had to face at present. The Avatar crisis affected the whole multiverse. If Soren did not join a divine system, then he had to create his own divine system. Or else, in the future, if any divine system fought with him, what Soren did today to besiege the Shadow Lord would repeat itself. No matter how strong he was, it was difficult for two fists to fight against four hands. At that time, the situation would be extremely passive. These days, even the goddess of agriculture, a non-combat god, had a group of goddess of river and goddess of lake as subordinate gods. If Soren did not cultivate a few of his own subordinate gods, he was afraid that in the future, it would be too embarrassing to say hello to other gods with great divine power. If Soren wanted to cultivate a divine system, then he had to start planning now. First of all, Saruman could be a seed with great potential. Then there was Vivian, who was becoming a demigod. These were the two candidates for the divine system. Vivian would have to face the Dread Lord in the future. When Soren was strong enough, he would also attack the Dreadlord's kingdom, and then completely destroy the throne of Dread and kill the Dreadlord. In this way, Soren's divine system might have two great divine power in the future. This was also why he had never thought of joining other divine systems. In addition, Soren would definitely separate the half-elf clergy in the future. This could be used to cultivate a race of gods. Then there was the power of the pirate domain. It was very easy for Soren to condense the pirate divinity. If any of his subordinates were strong enough to become gods, he could also consider giving the pirate clergy to one of them. For now, Soren was not completely without the foundation of forming his own divine system. P.S. It's so cool to organize the attributes every time. This chapter was quickly finished. Chapter 831. Windspear Hills. Suemi City. This was a city with a long history. Although it had been destroyed several times in war, it was eventually rebuilt by people. This was a city very close to the Windspear Hills and also a city close to the Forest Elves. Now the Avatar crisis had also caused a lot of impact on this city. Refugee camps could be seen outside the city. However, Suemi City was better than other places in that it had a good garrison, so there was not much loss in the attack of the demons. Tremont Tavern. A tall figure pushed the door and walked in. Although she was covered with a cloak, one could still see the exquisite curves of her body and fiery red long hair. This was a female adventurer, and a very beautiful one at that. Many other people in the tavern turned their heads, and some frivolous men couldn't help but whistle. But when the other party glanced at them coldly, these people immediately shrank their necks and stopped talking. That was a very dangerous gaze. And as adventurers who had been on the knife's edge all year round, they knew very well that this kind of gaze often meant that the other party was a woman who had been stained with a lot of blood. This woman was very strong and they couldn't afford to provoke her. The tall and seductive woman glanced around the tavern, and then her eyes fell on a man sitting in the corner. It was a rather down-and-out middle-aged adventurer with a face full of whiskers. The equipment on his body was a bit shabby, and it seemed that it had not been repaired for a long time. "Are you André?" The beautiful woman with fiery red long hair came directly in front of the middle-aged adventurer, then sat opposite him unceremoniously and said directly, "Looking at the scar on your neck, you should be André Lot?" The middle-aged man's expression was quite alert. He involuntarily pressed his hand on the hilt and said in a deep voice, "Who are you? Why do you know me?" He was just an unknown adventurer. Although he lived all the way to middle age except for leaving scars all over his body, he didn't accumulate much wealth. Many adventurers wanted to earn a lot of money when they were young, and then live a quiet life as a noble manor owner in their old age. But in fact, there were very few adventurers who could do this. Most of them were strong and lucky. Most of them were adventurers like André. When they reached middle age, they had no choice but to give up adventuring and find a place to live in seclusion and become a member of the guards. The red-haired woman glanced at him indifferently and then showed him a token. It was a black token, and the emblem on it represented one of the most famous places in the Outer Islands. Moto. The middle-aged man couldn't help but let out a cry of surprise, and then he quickly suppressed it as if he realized something. However, his voice still trembled with a trace of excitement and fear. He looked at the red-haired woman in front of him with a respectful expression and said respectfully, "Your Excellency. What business do you have with me?" André couldn't help but call her Your Excellency. Because of the iconic fiery red long hair of the woman in front of him, he couldn't help but think of a legendary figure. Although she rarely appeared at present, there was still such a figure among the pirate leaders in Moto City, and she was the only woman among the many pirate leaders in Moto City. Thinking of this, André couldn't help but swallow, and he recalled something that happened some time ago. The red-haired woman waved to the bartender to bring the most expensive wine here. This kind of tequila that cost 3 Kindler for a glass was not something André could afford at all, but these seemed to be nothing to the red-haired woman in front of him. She first motioned for André to have a drink, then slowly said, "I heard that you have news of an interesting thing in your hands. I came to you personally for this matter." The red-haired woman's attitude was very casual, but André's heart sank, and then he couldn't help but become nervous. It was really for this thing. André couldn't help but show a wry smile. As expected, he shouldn't have said that after drinking. Although he tried to deny it afterward, some people had already noticed him. The red-haired woman picked up the expensive tequila and just glanced at it, then slowly said, To be honest, even if you know where this thing is, it's not something you can get with your strength. It's better to tell us the news in exchange for some more reasonable rewards. At your age, it's time to arrange your future for yourself. Are you going to learn from those guys who can't even pick up a sword when they're old and poor until they die? The red-haired woman's words made Andrei hesitated. But then the other party's words destroyed his last trace of hope. The red-haired woman slowly said, Sir Soren must also be very interested in this thing you know. Sir Soren. Andrei's expression changed drastically. To an adventurer like him, this name was a legend that he didn't even dare to imagine. If that Sir wanted to obtain this item, the fact that this red-haired lady was still sitting in front of him and chatting with him was already a very generous attitude. What can I get? Andrei swallowed hard. He knew that he should take a stand at this moment. Otherwise he might not be able to walk out of this tavern. He thought about it seriously and said, If I tell you the news, what can I get? The red-haired woman couldn't help but smile. She seemed to be very satisfied with Andrei's attitude and slowly said, 2 choices, 30,000 Kindler. Or I can recommend you to find a position in the army of Mordor City. I think you should be competent with your strength. 30,000 Kindler. This was definitely a very amazing wealth for ordinary people. It was enough for Andrei to buy a manor and live comfortably like a noble for the rest of his life. However, now was the time of the Avatar crisis. Sometimes money was not as useful as it used to be. Andrei couldn't help but show a bitter smile. Even if he got so much money now, could he guarantee that he would be alive to spend it? Not to mention those adventurers who might be jealous, just the attack of the devils could kill him at any time. Now the manors outside were cheaper than the previous one. The nobles tried their best to get rid of the manors and live in the city because the defensive power of the manors was not enough to fight against the wandering devils. So he thought about it and made a choice. I choose to join the army of Mordor City. Join Mordor City. This was a very tempting choice. Although it could not bring Andrei a lot of wealth, it could give him a higher status. And Mordor City itself was a very special place. Very good. The red-haired woman smiled. She was not surprised by Andrei's choice and said slowly, a very wise choice. So, now you can tell me where the legendary Bodian sword is. P.S. First update. Today is the 3rd update. Chapter 832. Bodian. One of the most famous pirates in the material plane. He was a powerful pirate leader, the builder of the Baldur's Gate, and a great navigator. When Soren first rose to prominence, many people thought he would be another Bodian, including when Soren planned to build the city of Mordor. Many people were ready to watch him make a fool of himself. Because in the era when Bodian was active as the most powerful pirate force at the time, Bodian also built the Baldur's Gate, and when he left, he also infected 4 dukes to rule here. To some extent, everything Soren did in the beginning was very similar to Bodian. Even later on, after Bodian disappeared, the experiences of both sides were quite similar. For example, the outside world said that Bodian mysteriously disappeared, or died in the hands of the war creatures. But in fact, he had quietly dabbled in the realm of the gods, relying on his own strength to obtain the divine title of pirate. But after all, his talent was only mortal. Bodian did not directly ascend to godhood like Soren. Instead, he went through many twists and turns, and even fell into the realm of dark creatures because of some curse. But after missing for hundreds of years, he finally promoted as a demigod and became the god of pirates with minor divine power. In the records of the Arcane Empire, Bodian was active for a period of time, and most of his believers were pirates. Outside of the Avatar crisis, it was very difficult to ascend to godhood. It took nearly 600 to 800 years from Bodian's mysterious disappearance until he officially ascended to godhood. This was about the same time as Soren's original estimate. A mortal accumulates divinity and godhood through the normal way, then quietly develops believers, and finally officially ascends to godhood. At present, in the entire material plane, only the legendary pirate Bodian and the ancestral spirits served by the Vrykul pirates could be confirmed to have held the divine title of pirate. Soren also started as a pirate. It was just that he went much further than Bodian. But as the most powerful pirate king in the material plane, Soren's pirate domain was also one of the earliest domain abilities. Bodian's sword wasn't a powerful weapon. At best, the sword was a Tier 2 legendary equipment. However, it wasn't a single piece of equipment. Bodian's helmet, Bodian's armor, Bodian's cloak, and Bodian's sword were a complete set. After assembling a full set, The power of these equipment would be greatly enhanced, reaching the effect of some divine artifacts. Most importantly, in the legends of the pirates, they believed and were sure that the equipment left behind by Bodin would lead them to the path to godhood. Many pirates believed that they would be able to inherit Bodin's pirate priesthood after completing this set of equipment. The red-haired woman in front of him was Adele Isabella, who had begun to cultivate and advance to the legendary realm. Ever since she had handed over the affairs of the territory to others, she had begun to travel the entire continent. The news of obtaining the sword of Bodin was purely accidental. She only learned about it from the spies in Motor City. Originally, many people wouldn't take this kind of pub thing seriously. Maybe Andre was just bragging after getting drunk. But after careful analysis, Adele Isabella found that Andre had traveled to the sea, and in the end he was the only one who came back alive. This bizarre thing told her that the other party might really know something about Bodin. That's why she came here in person today. Bodin's sword. This sword was not a very important thing. What was more important was the news related to Bodin. Since the fall of the Arcane Empire, the legend of this legendary pirate had been circulating for a long time. And the treasure he left behind attracted a large number of pirates to explore, and Adele Isabella was also very interested in it. Soren naturally didn't know about this. This kind of trivial matter was not enough to alarm the ruler of Motor City. Adele Isabella's actions today were completely personal. Of course. If they could really find Bodin's treasure, or even find the pirate clergy that he had left behind, then Adele Isabella would definitely make a great contribution. When the time came, she would offer it to the city of Mordor, and her status would definitely skyrocket. But it was better not to alarm Sir Soren now. If they found only a piece of equipment used by Bodin and no other clues, then Adele Isabella would be embarrassed after alarming Soren. The reason why the red-haired female pirate was so convinced that the legend was true, and that the Bodin set really had clues to godhood. It was mainly because she found something very interesting through the secret library of the Northern Witch Council. Because in the information of the Northern Witch Council, Bodin's sword was not a very powerful equipment, but it had a very special ability that was to increase a person's legend. The person who owned this sword would immediately become famous among the pirates, and they would have a reputation far beyond other pirates. Why would a sword have such a special ability that had nothing to do with combat? There was only one reason, that was to become a god. One needed legend of the countryside. Adele Isabella didn't know much about the gods, but she still had an intuition that if she found the Bodin set, it would definitely be of great benefit to her. Moreover, Sir Gloria seemed to have plans to deal with the Beholder recently. One of the famous Bodin set, Bodin's shield, had a very special ability that was, it could directly reflect the Beholder's rays. Adele Isabella wanted to see if she could use the clues to find other parts of the Bodin set. Andre didn't hesitate for long after getting the red-haired woman's promise. He simply took out an ancient drawing and handed it to Adele Isabella, and slowly said, "This is the clue I got. The legendary parts of the Bodin set are hidden here. Thousands of years ago, the descendants of the god of massacre, Baal, also received these pieces of equipment. But they were later placed in other places by the god of massacre. This island used to be called Pirate Island. But now more than half of it has sunk. This sea area is a very dangerous place. It is said that there is an ancient ruin called Anti-Magic Prison nearby. The big explosion during the Arcane Empire caused the land to split and deviate. There are currently many mutated creatures in this sea area. The last time I led a group of people through this sea area, they were completely annihilated. I was the only one who escaped." At this point, Andre pointed at a certain location on the map and said in a deep voice, "This is the place where we encountered the giant sea monster. The pirate island is here, and the legendary anti-magic prison is here. This place is very dangerous." Hearing Andre's words, Adele Isabella's expression changed and she said in a deep voice, "The god of massacre? Is this thing related to the god of massacre? Seems like I have to change my mind. You have to go to Motor City with me now." Chapter 833. The God of Massacre, Baal. Who would have thought that this matter would involve one of the three ancient gods of death? Even if Adele Isabella was ignorant, she should know that she had to report this matter to Sir Soren. As one of Soren's most loyal followers, she could access the power of the realm far more than other priests, including Soren's massacre realm, which was also one of the sources of power that Adele Isabella could access. However, whether or not she could gain comprehension from the slaughter domain and grasp a trace of the power of slaughter would depend on her own innate ability. Since this matter involved the god of massacre, this news had to be sent back to Sir Soren. According to Andre, the location of the Bodian suit should be within the range of the big explosion during the period of the Arcane Empire. At that time, the violent explosions of the floating cities were not limited to the Eastern Kingdom. There were also floating cities in the overseas regions that were cruising around the entire material plane that fell into the sea and other places and caused violent explosions. At present, the location north of Treasure Island, where even Soren's fleet did not dare to approach, was the location where one of the floating city fell and exploded. Legend said that the giant whirlpool formed there used to be a piece of land, and at the bottom of the whirlpool there were some well-preserved ruins of the city. The energy radiation in this place was very scary. Although thousands of years had passed, and the damage of energy radiation to the human body had decreased a lot, the mutation caused by the strong radiation had completely affected and changed these places. There was no exception. These places with a high concentration of energy radiation were very dangerous, and the environment was several times more dangerous than the outer islands. If one were to use Sauron's words as an adventurer, it would be that these places were all high-difficulty instance dungeons. If the average level of the party members was not above level 15, it was simply a matter of death. This was a high-level map with a minimum challenge level of 15 and above, and even legendary masters could be wiped out if they entered. In the middle of the Avatar crisis, these ancient ruins that were discovered by people during the time of troubles were no less dangerous than exploring other planes. Some places even had a challenge level of 25 and above. In other words, even the incarnation of the gods could die if they entered. With Adele Isabella's identity, she could naturally mobilize the power of the Wind Spear Hills to gather a group of high-grade professionals, and then use her identity as one of the pirate leaders to form a fleet to explore. But from Andre's words, the red-haired female pirate learned that the danger of this place was far beyond her estimation. They didn't even manage to defeat the first sea monster they encountered. Before they even reached this place called Pirate Island, they were already wiped out. The warship that Andre had spent all his savings on and the sailors that he had recruited were all dead. That was why he was in such dire straits. Andre's reputation among the adventurers had plummeted after his party was wiped out and he was the only one alive. Otherwise, why would you be the only one who survived when everyone else died? Many adventurers kept a respectful distance from people with such an ending. Hearing that the red-haired female pirate wanted to take him to see the legendary Sir Soren, Andre's expression was obviously a hint of surprise and a hint of panic. He was very much in awe of this legendary figure, but now he had no choice at all. He could only follow Adele Isabella to Mordor City to see Soren. Any information about the god of massacre, Baal, was the focus of Mordor City. The rogues inside the church had been inquiring about clues related to the three gods of death. So that day, Adele Isabella took the rather panicked Andre to Mordor City. At the same time, the intelligence network of Mordor City also sent the news to Soren for the first time. Mordor City. War Chest Plain. After successfully killing the Shadow Lord, Soren had one less big problem in his heart. Now, as long as he killed the Dread Lord and destroyed his kingdom, then even if the Avatar crisis was over, Soren could live a relaxed life after becoming a real god with intermediate divine power. Therefore, if it was not the time of troubles, the gods who usually stayed in their kingdom were very safe. At present, Soren had the ability to protect himself. As long as he did not blatantly provoke the existence of those great gods, then the possibility of Soren safely surviving the Avatar crisis was very high. Soren had a plan to deal with the next few waves of attacks and even the conspiracy of the Lord of Hell, Asmodeus. The only difference was whether he wanted to intervene. If he did not intervene, the end of the material plane would definitely not be good. At that time, the people would inevitably be in a terrible situation. During this time, Soren's focus was on the research of the war chest plane. Although the traces of the goddess of fortune and the goddess of misfortune had appeared, and the relationship between the orc divine system and the elf divine system was also getting tense, Soren, as an outsider, could only watch coldly. There were some things that he could not intervene in. Taking advantage of the fact that the archdevils in the Bator Inferno had not made any big moves, and many really powerful demon lords were still watching, Soren naturally focused on improving his own strength. This was not only to improve his own strength, but also to improve the ability of the entire Mordor City to deal with the Avatar crisis. Soren's alchemy skills had been improving recently. At the same time, after obtaining the highest authority of the Arcane Tower, he could finally calm down and study how to control the special ability of the war chest plane. Soren's first challenge was naturally not optional, because apart from Soren, no one had successfully passed it. Whether it was Gloria or the fallen witches, all of them had been cheated by the original challenge. And this difficulty was to select the successor of the war chess plane. Others did not need to try such a difficult challenge at all. Soren needed to reduce the difficulty. Of course, it was not as simple as reducing the difficulty. He also needed to set and create the challenge content of the war chess plane. When he first met the demigod genie, Soren encountered a very simple war chess game. This represented that this kind of war chess game had many different contents during the Arcane Empire. What Soren had to do now was to create a trial content himself. This was like asking him to make a difficult RPG game, and then give this game to his elites to challenge and hone their strength. Soren's current idea was still based on demons and devils. Because during the Avatar crisis, these were the two enemies that mortals had to face the most. Soren's avatar was in the bottomless abyss, so he could easily simulate and create various demons and then use them as enemies in the trial. In this way, in the future, the elites under his command should have nothing to fear even in the face of intermediate and high-level demons. However, when Soren completed part of it and was about to start the preliminary test, Adele Isabella sent him a very important message. This news was related to the legendary massacre god. Bodian set? Soren silently looked at the information in his hand and murmured, "It seems that this set of equipment did fall into the hands of the massacre god at that time." PS, third update. Everyone can follow Futu's WeChat public account to give support. At the same time, if anyone is free, help Futu sort out the attributes of the Bodian set and post it in the book review area. Thank you very much. Chapter 834. The Massacre God's Child was active at the end of the last time of troubles. At that time there were many Massacre God's children in the material plane, and all of them were descendants of the god of massacre, Baal. The most powerful one among them began to rise from the Candle Castle, and he killed all the gods and demons that stood in his way until he reached Baal's throne. This Massacre God's Child was the final victor, and he obtained a lot of powerful equipment in this legendary adventure, including the Holy Avenger, the Archmage Staff, the Star of Day, and other divine weapons. According to the normal course of history, this Massacre God's Child should have inherited the clergy and become the god of massacre. But what was unexpected was that this Massacre God's Child's final choice was to destroy Baal's throne, and then choose to live in seclusion as a mortal. Soren admired this kind of person very much, but he certainly would not choose to do so. The Bodian set was one of the equipment that the Massacre God's children collected at that time. This set of equipment was related to the legendary pirate Bodian, and there were many hidden rumors after the Massacre God's Child ended. Pirate Island? Anti-magic prison? Soren looked at the map in front of him, and as if he remembered something, he murmured, "I think I know where this is. I can't believe this place hasn't sunk yet." The big explosion during the Arcane Empire directly caused the continental plates to move, and the world's continents would move gradually but very slowly. Even the continental shelf of Earth had changed a lot. The destruction of the Arcane Empire caused many continents to sink, and the structure of the outer islands changed because of this catastrophe. Should I send someone to explore? Soren fell into deep thought. He did not have time to explore the ruins himself, and he had just become an intermediate god, so he needed to familiarize himself with the operation of the Shadow Clergy. Ever since he merged with the Shadow Clergy, Soren's connection with the Shadow Plane had increased, and he recently discovered that he suddenly had a group of believers that he did not know about before. They were already showing signs of creatures of the Shadow Plane. The war chess plane still needed to be changing their faith. Mordor City was undergoing the shadow phase of the transformation whoever was in charge of the Shadow Clergy would be the god they served. There were also matter whether this god needed to be improved, or the original Shadow skills that needed to be improved. Soren also had to take over the Shadow Church and the Shadow Thieves Guild. There were many other things that Soren had to deal with. Although
If
the
Soren
use of
completely
simulacrum could
annexed
bring
them,
some
the
convenience
power
to
of
Soren,
Mordor would be
the
further
simulacrum
improved,
could not last
especially
long after
the
all.
profession of rogues.
Exploring the
It could be
ancient
said
ruins
that he
took
almost
too long,
completely
and the
controlled the
simulacrum
most
could
elite
not
group
last
of
that
rogues
long.
in the entire
Unless
material
Soren
plane.
created a new avatar,
Furthermore,
but
after defeating the
Shadow
Shadow
divine
Lord,
power.
Soren's control
Soren
over
had to
the Thieves'
accumulate
Union
power,
had increased
because as a god
exponentially.
who did not have a direct combat clergy, Soren could only be promoted to a greater divine power by mastering the power of Avatar, and he still had a lot of divine power that needed to be gained through divine power. At present, the most important thing for Soren was to accumulate power. But the Bordian set might not be a big deal. At most, it would bring clues to the pirate clergy, and the pirate island was not a big deal. However, the anti-magic prison was a place that Soren was very curious about. Because here might be able to complete some of the power of the Lock of Mordor City, such as restricting other spellcasters' ability to cast spells on the island of Mordor. Are you still thinking about it? Gloria's figure appeared outside the door. She glanced at Soren, who was frowning slightly, and said slowly, "Is it about the anti-magic prison? Why don't you send a pair of legendary professions? As a god, maybe you should change your mind. You can't do everything by yourself. Also, Mordor City is not incapable of forming a legendary adventurer team." Gloria saw Soren's expression and continued softly, "The High Priest doesn't have much to do at the moment. You can let her be the commander of this expedition. Since there are deep-sea monsters here, you can also send your little pet. The giant also needs some battle practice recently. You don't have to worry about the problem of a meat shield with it. If you are still worried, you can also send the little girl in the temple. In case something happens, you can come in person at any time." Gloria's words suddenly made Soren's mind clear. That's right. He didn't need to do everything by himself. The High Priest was a level 30 psionic warlock. There was basically no problem with her leading the team, and she was also an astral explorer. She had rich experience in dealing with all kinds of dangers. Also, the giant's brain was not very good. He stayed in Mordor City to train every day. He did not manage things like other pirate leaders. It was just right to send him out to experience things. Moreover, the little girl mentioned by Gloria was the Saint Priest Milan in the church. If he brought her, in case there was any danger, Soren could directly come in her body. Once his mind was clear, Soren quickly had a candidate in mind. First of all, the High Priest must go. If she didn't go, Soren would not be at ease at all. Then there was the red-haired female pirate Adele Soren. Then there was the Saint Priest Milan, the legendary warrior, the giant, and the rogue who was most likely to advance into legendary, the ugly monkey. There were already 5 people involved in this. The High Priest could completely replace the legendary wizard. The Saint Priest Milan's performance on the spot was far better than that of a legendary priest. Adele, Isabella could be an agile warrior. The giant was an irreplaceable legendary meat shield. The talent of the ugly monkey was first class among all rogues. A team of 5 people had been formed. Coupled with the fleet of Mordor City and Soren's pet mutant killer whale, their combat power was already amazing. However, Soren thought about it and prepared to add a small team of drow warriors. In addition, he could deploy an archbishop to assist the priest. After all, the Saint Priest Milan was very important to Soren. With such a configuration, they could even fight against the incarnation of the gods. The key was that Soren could come in person to Milan at any time. Chapter 835. Soren quickly decided on the person who would carry out the mission. However, after looking at it for a while, Gloria gently sat on Soren's lap, twisted her soft body to find a comfortable position, then reached out and tapped on the list and slowly said, "Lulu can also go out and exercise. This little girl's potential is amazing." "Lulu?" Soren's expression was a little surprised when he heard this, and his expression seemed to be a little doubtful. It was not that he didn't know Lulu's talent. As one of the few cat beasts in the material plane, her talent was absolutely amazing, but how long had Lulu been training? Could she really be sent to such a difficult ancient ruin to train? No problem. After all, Gloria knew Lulu's situation better than Soren. She was also one of the people responsible for training and teaching Lulu. She slowly said, "Lulu is not much worse than the ugly monkey, and this little girl seems to have met someone." Gloria's words made Soren hesitate for a moment, but he was also a very decisive person, so he immediately said, "Okay. Then let Lulu go out and exercise with us." Gloria smiled when she heard the words, reached out and stroked Soren's face and then said, "The preliminary test of the ghost ship, Dead Man's Voice has been completed. At present we only need to carry out a practical test. Since they are going to dangerous ancient ruins this time, let's send the ghost ship, Dead Man's Voice, to go with them for a practical test. The ghost ship, Dead Man's Voice. This was a big killer weapon of Mordor City, and it was also one of Sorin's signboards as the Pirate King. The original ghost ship, Dead Man's Voice, already had a very powerful combat power, and now after the joint transformation of Gloria and Fallen Witch, its combat power had skyrocketed by more than a little. Now the Dead Man's Voice could go up to the sky and down to the sea. Its firepower was extremely fierce, and it was a legendary level undead construct. Such a thing obviously couldn't be tested by conventional means, and there was no war in Mordor City that required the use of such a weapon. So when Gloria proposed a practical test, Sorin immediately became interested. He reached out and picked up Gloria, then reached under her skirt with his right hand, groping while climbing up, and slowly said, "Has the test of the floating ring been completed? Can we carry out the practical test now?" Gloria's breathing quickened, and a faint blush appeared on her beautiful face. She said softly, "The test of the floating ring has been completed. When we built the floating space tower, we completed the test application of the floating ring, and then we immediately used it on the Dead Man's Voice. The current flying condition is very stable. A small energy shield has also been arranged, but the Dead Man's Voice itself is a legendary undead construct. It can directly repair the hull with the power of the earthbound spirit, so we didn't arrange a large energy shield." Sorin nodded, but his hand had already moved to Gloria's full chest. He was very clear about the characteristics of the Dead Man's Voice. After all, this legendary ghost ship was upgraded by him bit by bit. The Dead Man's Voice looked a bit tattered, but it was actually very sturdy. After being promoted to a legendary undead construct, its durability was even higher than that of a steel battleship. Moreover, it could repair itself very quickly. Such a legendary undead construct only needed to arrange a small energy shield, and even the small energy shield could be removed if it was not to protect the sails of the ghost ship. In terms of firepower? Sorin pinched the woman in his arms and said in a deep voice, "Has the simplification of the superconducting magical pulse cannon been completed?" Gloria hesitated for a moment and said slowly, "It's not completely completed yet. But we used the alchemy technology of the Northern Witch Council to install a small magical cannon on the Dead Man's Voice. It can fire about 3 times, but we don't know the specific effect yet. This actual combat test is also to see the offensive ability of the Dead Man's Voice. The original Dead Man's Voice had heavy boomerang cannons and Dead Man's Voice cannons. The firepower of these cannons was at the level after the Great Voyage. Compared to the alchemy technology of the Arcane Empire, it was nothing. Gloria and Fallen Witch modified it, replacing part of the original Dead Man's Voice cannons and adding a simplified magical cannon. It was not that they couldn't add more, but because the Dead Man's Voice did not have enough energy, adding more would just be a decoration. "That's good." Sorin thought for a moment and said in a deep voice, "Then let's set off together and test its actual combat ability." The Dead Man's Voice was a key to Sorin's future plan. After all, the power of Mordor City was mainly concentrated in overseas areas, and the main battlefield in the future would definitely be on the mainland. There were not many forces in Mordor that could be deployed on the mainland. The army was obviously not suitable for mobilization, and the cost of mobilization was too high. Sorin's fleet could only traverse the sea, and there were not many places where it could be used in the future. At present, the only force that could carry out expeditions in Mordor City was the Wyvern Knights. This number was simply not enough, and it would be too painful to lose them. Then there was the floating space tower, but the floating space tower was the biggest weapon of Mordor City, and it also needed to regulate the entire Mordor City's defense. No matter how you look at it. At present, the only thing that could carry out expeditions in Mordor City and had enough lethality was the ghost ship, the Dead Man's Voice. With the firepower of the Dead Man's Voice, coupled with the teleportation tactics of Mordor City's Golem Legion, it should be able to play a decisive role in several very important battles in the future. Sorin's purpose of self-protection was basically about to be achieved. It was true that he liked to be alone, but he couldn't completely sit back and watch the material plane being riddled with holes. As a high god, he more or less had to do something. This was the duty of the gods to maintain the order of the law, and he couldn't just sit back and watch them fight. In the end, he directly smashed the material plane, which was the chessboard of the gods. This was a different position, and the perspective of things was different. In the beginning, Soren did not hesitate to overturn the chessboard in order to protect himself. But now he was a god with intermediate divine power, and one of the people who was qualified to play chess in the material plane, so he had the responsibility to ensure that the chessboard of the material plane could continue. Looking at the current structure of Mordor City, he knew that Soren's plan was not small. Mordor City was a chessboard and the material plane was a bigger chessboard. On the chessboard of Mordor City, Soren already had absolute power, but on the chessboard of the material plane, Soren still needed to arrange more chess pieces that could be used. As a high and mighty deity, he was a god. Soren could not always fight in person like in the past. He now had to learn to be a chess player in the material plane like other gods. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.